You already know how this goes. The alarm sounds, you feel it, the familiar weight before you've even opened your eyes. By the time you're in the shower, the same thoughts are circling, the conversation you replayed 100 times, the worry you promised yourself you'd let go, the version of yourself you keep almost becoming. You've read the books. You've made the promises. And somehow, here you are again, caught in the same loop, the same reactions, the same quiet frustration with yourself. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. And that is precisely why it can be changed. This book will show you how. Stay with me. Introduction: Your brain is not fixed. There's a version of this story you've probably told yourself, that's just how I am. Maybe you've said it about your temper, the way it flares before you can catch it. Maybe it's about your tendency to catastrophize, to spiral, to withdraw when things get hard. Maybe it's about the way you consistently undermine yourself just as something good is beginning. You've watched it happen enough times that the pattern feels like personality. Like bedrock. Like something you were simply born carrying. That belief is understandable. It's also incorrect. For most of recorded history, it was the official scientific position. Until relatively recently, neuroscientists taught that the adult brain was essentially fixed, that after a certain point in childhood development, the architecture was set. You had the neurons you had, wired the way they were wired, and life was largely a matter of working within those constraints. Personality, emotional responses, habitual thinking patterns, these were considered the product of genetics and early environment, more or less permanent. Then the research started to tell a different story. Neuroscientists discovered that the adult brain is not fixed at all. It is constantly reorganizing itself, forming new connections, pruning old ones, shifting the weight it gives to different pathways based on what you repeatedly think, feel, and do. This property has a name: neuroplasticity. And it changes everything about how we understand human change. This book is about what that actually means for you, not in theory, not in a lab, but in the specific and difficult texture of your daily life. What this book is not. Let's be direct about something. There is a genre of self-help that takes the word neuroplasticity and uses it as a scientific-sounding wrapper for the same old advice: think positive, visualize your goals, believe in yourself. That is not this book. Affirmations alone don't rewire neural pathways. Wishful thinking doesn't alter the structure of your brain. And if you've tried those approaches and found them hollow, your skepticism is warranted. This book is also not a promise of effortless transformation. Real change, the kind that shows up in your actual behavior, in actual situations, with actual people, requires repetition, discomfort, and honest self-examination. There is no shortcut around that. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. There is another version of this genre that errs in the opposite direction, so technically rigorous, so laden with caveats and research citations, that it produces the feeling of understanding without any path to application. You finish knowing a great deal about your brain and no more equipped than before to do anything differently with it. This book tries to avoid that trap too. The science is real and it's described accurately. But the point of understanding it is always practical, to help you see your own patterns clearly, understand why they're so resistant to change, and use the mechanism of neuroplasticity deliberately. This book is not going to ask you to become someone fundamentally different. The goal is not to erase your history or manufacture a personality that isn't yours. The goal is to give you genuine choice, to loosen the grip of patterns that currently operate on autopilot, running your responses before your conscious mind has had any say in the matter. What this book is: this is a practical guide to neuroplasticity, grounded in what neuroscience and psychology actually tell us about how the brain changes, and translated into practices you can use without a laboratory or a clinical setting. You'll understand why your brain defaults to the same patterns even when you desperately want to change them. You'll learn what it actually takes, neurologically, behaviorally, emotionally, to build new pathways and weaken old ones. And you'll be given 3 levels of structured protocol to match where you are right now, whether you're just waking up to your patterns, ready for sustained rewiring, or in need of something deeper. The science here is real. The researchers cited throughout these chapters, people like Michael Merzenich, Norman Doidge, Susan Nolen-Hoeksema, Daniel Goleman, Sarah Lazar, and others, have spent careers studying how the brain changes. Their findings are not fringe ideas, they are the new consensus in cognitive neuroscience. What this book does is translate that consensus into something usable. The goal is not to make you fluent in neuroscience, though you'll come away with a working understanding of it. The goal is to give you an accurate map of how your brain actually operates, accurate enough that you can use it to navigate the specific territory of your own patterns rather than continuing to apply generic strategies that don't account for the biology underneath. That matters because the biology underneath is specific. The reason thought loops are so hard to stop is not a character weakness, it's a measurable feature of how the default mode network operates. The reason emotional reactivity survives your best intentions is not a failure of discipline, it's a description of the timing difference between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. When you understand the mechanism, you can work with it instead of against it. When you're working against it blind, you exhaust yourself and confirm the story that nothing changes. How this book is structured: the book moves through 3 parts, each building on the last. Part 1, the science, covers the foundational neuroscience you need to understand before you can use it. What neuroplasticity actually is, how it works at the level of neurons and synapses, and why your brain has default patterns in the first place. This section gives you the map. It explains why your patterns feel like truth rather than habit, why motivation alone doesn't change them, and what the brain actually requires to build new pathways. Don't skip it even if you're impatient to get to the protocols. The protocols only make sense and only work correctly when you understand the mechanism they're designed to engage. Part 2, the diagnosis, takes that science and turns it toward your specific situation. What are your entrenched patterns? Are you a ruminator, a reactor, an avoider, a self-saboteur? How do thought loops work, and what do they cost you? How does emotional reactivity operate, and where does it show up in your relationships? This section gives you honest self-knowledge, not to shame you, but because you can't rewire a pattern you haven't accurately identified. A generic rewiring effort applied to an unspecified pattern produces generic, usually temporary results. Specific self-knowledge applied to a specific pattern produces targeted, sustainable change. Part 3, the protocols, is where the work happens. 3 levels of structured reset, a 7-day pattern interrupt for beginners, a 21-day rewiring system for those ready to go deeper, and a 30-day neural architecture rebuild for patterns that are deeply rooted. A final chapter on sustaining what you build, because the goal isn't a temporary improvement but a permanent upgrade to how your brain operates by default. Part 3 is designed to be returned to repeatedly, not just read once and set aside. The protocols are most effective when they're actually used, which means used in the specific conditions of your specific life, and calibrated over time based on what you learn. A note on the science: every significant claim in this book is grounded in published research. The researchers named throughout are real people whose work you can and should explore further if the science interests you. Where the research is clear, it's described clearly. Where there is genuine uncertainty or ongoing debate in the field, that's noted rather than papered over with false confidence. The science of neuroplasticity is not simple, and some of the popular versions of it, the "you can rewire your brain in 21 days" formulations, are oversimplifications that generate unrealistic expectations and then disappointment. The actual research tells a more complicated story. Change is real, it's measurable, and it follows specific principles. It also requires sustained effort, occurs at different rates for different people in different types of patterns, and does not protect against regression under sufficient stress. Understanding the complications doesn't make the change less real or less worth pursuing. It makes your expectations accurate, which means you're better prepared for the actual experience of rewiring, including the parts that are difficult, counterintuitive, or slower than you'd like. Accurate expectations are not pessimism. They're the foundation of sustainable effort. An honest word before we begin: change is possible. That is not a motivational claim, it is the conclusion of decades of neuroscience research. The brain you have today is not the brain you have to keep. But the process of changing it is neither quick nor painless. It requires you to catch yourself in the moment, which is uncomfortable. It requires you to act differently when every instinct pulls you toward the familiar, which is hard. And it requires you to do it repeatedly, not once, not twice, but enough times that a new pathway becomes the brain's preferred route. You don't need to be perfect at this. You need to be consistent. You need to be honest. And you need to understand what you're actually doing when you practice these protocols, not just following instructions, but physically altering the structure of your own brain. That is an extraordinary thing to be able to do. Most people never realize they're doing it constantly, they're just doing it unconsciously, reinforcing the same worn grooves deeper and deeper. This book is about taking that process off autopilot. One more thing before we begin. Wherever you are in relation to your patterns, however long they've been running, however many times you've tried to change and found the same terrain waiting for you, you are in the right place. The research on neuroplasticity does not expire. The brain retains its capacity for change at every stage of adult life. There is no version of your history that puts the rewiring beyond reach. The question has never been whether the mechanism is available to you. The question is whether you're ready to use it. Let's begin. Practical reflection before moving to Chapter 1, take 5 minutes with these questions. Write your answers if you can. The act of writing engages more of the brain's processing than just thinking does, activating different memory and integration systems and creating a record you can return to. What is the one pattern in your behavior or thinking that you most want to change? Describe it specifically, not "I want to be less anxious," but what does the anxiety actually look like, when does it show up, and what does it make you do? How long have you identified this pattern as part of your life? When did it first appear, or when did you first notice it? Is there a version of your life in which you remember it being absent? What have you already tried? What worked partially, and what didn't work at all? What did the attempts that came closest have in common? What was missing from the attempts that produced the least change? The goal here is not to generate motivation or aspiration. It's to begin with accurate information about where you actually are, and what you're actually working with. The gap between who you are and who you want to be is not a failure, it's the space in which this book lives. Chapter 1: What Neuroplasticity Actually Is. In 1906, the Spanish neuroscientist Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who would win a Nobel Prize for his work mapping the structure of the nervous system, made a declaration that would define neuroscience for most of the 20th century. He wrote that in adult brains, the nerve paths are something fixed, ended, immutable. He was describing what he believed to be a fundamental law of biology, that the brain, unlike other tissues in the body, does not regenerate, reorganize, or build new structure after development. You were born with the neurons you'd have. The connections between them were set in early childhood. And that was that. This view was so widely accepted, so embedded in scientific culture, that for decades any researcher who suggested otherwise was dismissed. The idea that an adult human brain could physically change based on experience was considered not just wrong but naive, the kind of hope people had before they understood the hard reality of biology. That consensus is now completely overturned. The discovery that changed everything. The shift began quietly, in individual labs, with findings that didn't fit the old model. One of the most striking came from research on musicians. Neuroscientist Alvaro Pascual León studied the cortical maps, the brain regions dedicated to processing different parts of the body, of professional keyboard players. What he found was that the region of the cortex devoted to the fingers of the playing hand was measurably larger in musicians than in non-musicians. The brain had physically allocated more real estate to the fingers that were used most. More provocatively, his later work showed that even mental practice, imagining the piano exercises without actually playing them, produced similar cortical changes. The brain was being reshaped not just by physical action but by sustained mental activity. This was not supposed to be possible. But it was happening, reproducibly, in labs around the world. Around the same time, Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco was conducting experiments that would become foundational in neuroplasticity research. He was working with monkeys, mapping the sensory cortex with precision, and making a discovery that upended the textbook consensus: the brain's maps were not fixed. When he altered which finger received stimulation, the cortical map reorganized itself to match. The brain was responding to experience by literally restructuring its own physical organization. Merzenich spent subsequent decades developing the implications of his findings for human learning, aging, and rehabilitation. His work on cognitive training, the demonstration that targeted mental practice can maintain and even improve brain function in aging adults, emerged directly from this foundational insight: the brain reorganizes around what it does repeatedly. If you repeatedly practice attention, attention-related circuits grow stronger. If you repeatedly practice complex pattern recognition, the regions that process those patterns become more elaborately organized. The brain is, in a sense, the world's most sophisticated adaptive system, constantly updating its own architecture based on the feedback it receives from experience. The word that came to describe this property was neuroplasticity, from neuro, relating to neurons, the brain's primary cells, and plasticity, the capacity to be shaped or molded. The adult brain, far from being a fixed structure, is in a constant state of reorganization, driven by what you repeatedly experience, think, and do. What is actually happening at the neuron level? To understand neuroplasticity, you need a working picture of what neurons actually do. Your brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron is a cell that can receive signals from thousands of other neurons and send signals to thousands more. These signals travel across tiny gaps between neurons called synapses. When one neuron fires, it releases chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, that cross the synapse and either excite or inhibit the next neuron in the chain. The key insight is this: the strength of these synaptic connections is not fixed. It changes based on activity. When two neurons fire at the same time, repeatedly, the synapse between them becomes stronger, the connection is reinforced, and it becomes easier for that signal to travel between them in the future. When they rarely fire together, the connection weakens. This was first articulated in 1949 by the Canadian neuropsychologist Donald Hebb, in a principle that has become one of the most quoted in all of neuroscience: neurons that fire together, wire together. This principle is the biological engine of learning, habit, and pattern. Every time you have a particular thought, every time you have a particular emotional response, every time you perform a particular action, you are activating a specific constellation of neurons. The more you activate that constellation, the stronger those connections become. The more entrenched the pattern, the more efficiently the signal travels, until the pattern runs automatically, without conscious initiation, without effort. This is neuroplasticity in its most basic form, the physical strengthening and weakening of synaptic connections based on use. The practical implication is immediate and profound: the brain is not passive. It is continuously sculpting itself based on what you do with it. Every repeated thought, every habitual response, every practiced skill or practiced worry is contributing to the physical structure of the organ through which you experience everything. This is happening whether you intend it or not. The question this book is asking is whether you'd like to do it deliberately. Beyond synapses, structural change but neuroplasticity goes deeper than synaptic strength. The brain doesn't just adjust the efficiency of existing connections, it builds new ones and prunes others. In response to sustained new experiences and learning, the brain grows new dendritic branches, the tree-like extensions of neurons that receive signals from other cells. It can increase the density of synaptic connections in a region. In some areas, particularly the hippocampus, critical for memory and learning, new neurons can actually be generated through a process called neurogenesis. The discovery of adult neurogenesis, that the adult brain produces new neurons, was itself considered impossible until the late 20th century, when researchers including Fred Gage at the Salk Institute provided clear evidence that it occurs. The hippocampus is especially relevant here because it is involved in memory formation, the regulation of stress response, and the processing of new information, all of which are central to the kind of change this book is describing. Neurogenesis in the hippocampus is influenced by a specific set of factors that the protocols in Part 3 are designed around: aerobic exercise, the most potent known stimulator of hippocampal neurogenesis, cognitive engagement, reduced chronic stress, and adequate sleep. These aren't arbitrary wellness suggestions. They are the conditions under which the brain's capacity for physical change is maximized. Exercise, in particular, has been shown to dramatically increase neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So has learning new skills, navigating novel environments, and engaging in cognitively demanding tasks. Chronic stress, conversely, suppresses neurogenesis and can even cause structural shrinkage in regions like the prefrontal cortex. This is the dark inverse of plasticity. The same mechanism that allows positive change also allows negative change, and the brain responds to chronic stressors by physically reducing the capacity for the deliberate, reflective cognition that makes positive change possible. This is not metaphorical language. These are measurable, physical changes to the structure of your brain. The organ you have today is not the same organ you had 5 years ago. It has been shaped, continuously, by everything you've repeatedly experienced, thought, and done. The misconception you need to abandon here is the version of neuroplasticity that gets most commonly oversimplified, that change requires extraordinary experiences, trauma, dramatic new environments, formal meditation retreats, brain training software, or some kind of peak emotional event. This is not what the science shows. What the research shows is that small, repeated actions create measurable structural change. The distinguishing variable is not intensity but repetition. Merzenich's work demonstrated that sustained, focused practice even on simple tasks reliably alters cortical maps. The musicians didn't change their brains in one virtuosic performance, they changed them through thousands of hours of practice. The change is cumulative. It accretes, like sediment, each repetition adding an almost imperceptible layer, until one day the landscape has genuinely shifted. This is both more demanding and more accessible than the dramatic version. More demanding, because it removes the idea that one insight, one retreat, one breakthrough moment will do the work. More accessible, because it means that every single time you catch a habitual thought and redirect it, every time you pause before a reactive response, every time you practice a new behavior in a difficult situation, you are contributing to a structural change in your brain. The magnitude of any single instance is tiny. The aggregate, over time, is transformative. The flip side of this is equally important. Every time you run the thought loop, every time you react automatically, every time you avoid the thing you're afraid of, you are also contributing to a structural change. In the direction you don't want. The brain is always changing. The practice of this book is about making that change deliberate. There is a second misconception worth addressing, that neuroplasticity is primarily about learning new skills, languages, musical instruments, athletic techniques. While these are vivid examples of the mechanism in action, they're not what makes neuroplasticity relevant to most people's daily lives. What's more relevant is the plasticity of the brain's emotional regulation systems, its threat detection calibration, its habitual thought patterns, and its automatic social responses. These are the neural systems that determine the quality of your inner life and the texture of your relationships. And they are every bit as plastic, every bit as capable of change through deliberate practice as the motor systems that learn to play piano. What rewiring actually means: there is a popular way of talking about neuroplasticity that can be misleading, the idea that you erase old patterns and replace them with new ones. This is not quite right, and understanding the distinction matters both for accurate expectations and for how you respond when old patterns reassert themselves. Old neural pathways don't disappear. They weaken through disuse, a process called synaptic pruning, but the pathway remains. What happens when you successfully rewire a pattern is not deletion but competition. You build a new pathway that becomes stronger, more efficient, and more easily activated than the old one. In a situation that used to trigger the old automatic response, the new pathway fires first, not because the old one is gone, but because the new one has become the brain's preferred route. This is why, under conditions of extreme stress, old patterns can resurface even after significant rewiring work. The old pathway is still there, and when the prefrontal cortex, the brain's deliberate, conscious decision-making center, goes offline under acute stress, older, more primitive pathways can take over. This is not failure. It's neuroscience. Understanding it helps you respond to regression with curiosity rather than despair. The chapter on sustaining the rewiring addresses this directly: how to recognize regression, how to understand what triggers it, and how to return to the new architecture without losing everything you built. Norman Doidge, the Canadian psychiatrist and author who brought neuroplasticity research to popular attention in his landmark book The Brain That Changes Itself, described this competitive quality of neural pathways vividly. He wrote about how the brain's plasticity means it can be used both for better and for worse, that the same mechanism that allows a stroke patient to relearn movement also allows an anxious mind to reinforce its catastrophizing through daily rumination. The brain changes based on what it does most. It doesn't discriminate between the patterns you want to strengthen and the ones you'd rather eliminate. It simply reinforces what is used. This is why the question, "What am I practicing?" is the most important question in this entire book. Not "What am I intending?" or "What am I trying to do?" but "What are you actually, repeatedly doing?" Because what you repeatedly do is what the brain is building. Not what you occasionally manage, not what you do under ideal conditions, not what you do when you're being observed, but the daily, automatic, unglamorous repetitions that constitute the bulk of your mental and behavioral life. Those repetitions are your neural architecture in progress. The researchers who proved this was real. Michael Merzenich spent decades making the case for neuroplasticity when it was still considered a minority view, and his work on brain training and cognitive reserve in aging has continued to push the science forward. He has argued, with considerable evidence, that cognitive decline associated with aging is not inevitable, that sustained mental engagement can maintain and even improve brain function into later life. His research is a direct challenge to the fatalism that has long surrounded discussions of aging and brain function. Norman Doidge, whose clinical work with patients recovering from strokes and brain injuries gave him a front-row seat to the brain's capacity for reorganization, documented cases that seemed miraculous until you understood the mechanism. A woman born with half a brain had, through development, reorganized the remaining hemisphere to perform the functions of both. A man who'd had a stroke relearned basic motor functions by building new neural routes around the damaged tissue. A man with chronic pain rewired the sensory processing that was generating the pain. These were not mysteries, they were neuroplasticity in extreme form, making visible a process that is always occurring at subtler scales. Sarah Lazar at Harvard demonstrated, through brain imaging studies, that long-term mindfulness meditation practitioners had measurably thicker cortex in regions associated with attention and interoceptive awareness, and that even an 8-week meditation program produced measurable structural changes, including reductions in amygdala volume that corresponded with reduced stress reactivity. This research was significant precisely because it showed that the timescale for measurable structural change was not years but weeks, that even relatively brief sustained practice could produce changes visible on a brain scan. Sharon Begley, whose science journalism helped bring neuroplasticity into broader cultural awareness, documented the convergence between ancient contemplative traditions and modern neuroscience in her book Train Your Mind, Change Your Brain. The collaboration between leading neuroscientists and the Dalai Lama's Mind and Life Institute produced a body of research on how meditation alters brain function that has continued to expand in the decades since. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin found measurable structural differences in the brains of long-term meditators, particularly in regions associated with emotional regulation and compassion, suggesting that what had been understood as fixed personality traits were, in fact, trainable skills with a neural substrate. The field is now beyond debate. The adult brain changes. It changes based on experience. It changes based on what you repeatedly do with it. The question is no longer whether this is possible. The question is how to do it deliberately. Practical reflection. Take a moment with these questions before moving on. Write your answers. The physical act of writing engages more neural pathways than passive thought, activating motor systems, visual processing, and semantic memory simultaneously. Think of a skill or ability you've built as an adult, something you weren't born knowing how to do and had to practice until it became natural. It doesn't have to be dramatic: driving, cooking a particular dish, a work skill, navigating a social situation that used to feel awkward. What did the early stages feel like, versus what it feels like now that it's automatic? Describe both stages in specific, sensory terms. That shift, from effortful to automatic, is the experience of neuroplasticity you've already lived. Now think about a thought pattern or emotional response that feels completely automatic to you. Something that fires so quickly you barely notice it happening. When did this pattern first appear in your life? Can you remember a time before it existed? What did it start as a reasonable response to a situation, and what has it become through years of repetition? How many times, roughly, do you estimate you've run this pattern? Each of those instances was a small repetition of a neural pathway. The automaticity you're experiencing now is the cumulative result of all of them. Consider what it would mean to apply the same principle that built the skill to this pattern. If practice built something you're proud of, practice can also build the patterns you actually want. The mechanism is identical. The only question is whether you're applying it consciously or unconsciously, whether your repetitions are chosen or inherited. Chapter 2: Why your brain defaults to the same patterns. Here is a fact about your brain that reframes everything. It is, above all else, an energy management system. The brain represents about 2% of your body weight, but it consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy budget. That is an extraordinary metabolic investment, and the brain has evolved elaborate mechanisms to manage it efficiently. One of the most powerful of these mechanisms is automation, the process of taking repeated sequences of thought, emotion, and behavior and converting them from effortful, conscious processes into efficient, automatic ones. Every time you repeat a thought or action, the brain works to make it cheaper to execute. The neural pathway becomes more myelinated, wrapped in a fatty sheath that dramatically speeds up signal transmission. The synaptic connections strengthen, so the signal travels more easily. The routine becomes encoded not in the cortex, where conscious deliberate thought happens, but in deeper, older brain structures that run their programs without requiring conscious attention. Your brain's defaults are not character flaws. They are efficiency solutions. The problem is that they were optimized for repetition, not for correctness. The brain didn't design your defaults to serve your long-term well-being. It designed them to conserve energy by automating whatever you've done most often, whether that's helpful or harmful, whether that's the person you want to be or the person you're desperately trying to leave behind. This is the most important thing to understand about your defaults. They are not reflections of who you truly are. They are reflections of what you've done most. The distinction is profound, because it shifts the question from how do I change who I am, which is difficult to even conceive of, to how do I change what I do most, which is a practical project with a known mechanism. How neural highways form. Think of your neural pathways the way you might think of trails through a forest. When you first walk a new route, a new thought, a new response, a new way of handling a situation, the path is rough. You have to push through undergrowth. It takes effort. You might lose the trail and have to find it again. The cognitive equivalent is that conscious feeling of working hard to think or behave differently, the awkwardness of a new habit, the constant sense that the old way would be so much easier. But if you walk that same route repeatedly, something changes. The ground compacts. The plants on either side begin to die back. The trail becomes clearer, easier to follow, faster to traverse. Walk it for years and it becomes a highway, something you can move through without conscious navigation, without effort, almost without noticing you're doing it. This is exactly what happens in your neural pathways. Repetition myelinates the pathway, speeds the signal, deepens the groove. And just as importantly, trails you stop using begin to grow over. They don't disappear, but they become less obvious, less accessible, slower to navigate. The brain preferentially routes signals down the paths it knows, the ones worn smooth by years of use. This process is completely neutral. The brain doesn't evaluate whether the pathway it's reinforcing is serving you well. It just routes the signal efficiently. If you've spent 20 years routing anxiety through catastrophic thinking, that pathway is now a superhighway. If you've never built the pathway of pausing before reacting, that path is a barely visible trail through dense undergrowth. The brain will choose the highway every time, not out of malice, not out of psychological weakness, but out of pure metabolic efficiency. Understanding this removes the most common and most paralyzing attribution error people make about their patterns, that the pattern reflects something essential and unchangeable about their character. The pattern reflects something about their history of repetition. History can be supplemented with new history. Repetition can be supplemented with new repetition. The pathway can be built, one practice at a time, until it competes successfully with the old one. The timeline for this competition to become meaningful is not fixed, it varies by pattern complexity, frequency of the old pathway's activation, and the consistency of the new practice. But the direction is always possible. The mechanism doesn't expire. The brain is never done building pathways, which means it is never done being buildable. The default mode network, your brain's resting rumination engine. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, neuroscientist Marcus Raichle at Washington University was studying brain imaging data and noticed something puzzling. When people were given no task to perform, when they were asked simply to rest inside a brain scanner, a particular network of brain regions became more active, not less. The brain wasn't quieting down in the absence of a task. It was doing something else. Raichle named this the default mode network, the set of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, that activate during unstructured mental time. Subsequent research revealed what this network was up to, thinking about the self, planning and replaying social situations, Running simulations of the future. Revisiting the past. Generating the narrative of me, the ongoing story you tell yourself about who you are, what you've done, what others think of you, and what's likely to happen next. The default mode network is, in many ways, the engine of your inner life. It is responsible for the capacity for self-reflection, for imagining other people's mental states, for planning and anticipating cognitive abilities that are among the most distinctively human. Without the default mode network, we lose access to the rich inner life that allows us to learn from the past and prepare for the future. The problem is that for many people, it is also the engine of rumination. When the default mode network is chronically hyperactive, particularly in the absence of strong engagement with the present moment, it tends to run its simulations in a negative direction. This is not random. It reflects the negativity bias that is deeply embedded in the brain's threat detection architecture. The brain's default, evolutionarily speaking, is to scan for danger, to model worst-case scenarios, to remain alert to social threats, to replay situations looking for what went wrong. In an ancestral environment of genuine physical danger, this was adaptive. In the environment most of us actually inhabit, one where the threats are social, professional, and existential rather than predatory, the same mechanism generates an almost continuous background noise of worry, self-criticism, comparison, and doubt. What you experience as overthinking or being in your head is often the default mode network running unchecked, replaying conversations, modeling future humiliations, constructing narratives of inadequacy. And because this is the brain's default, it runs automatically, particularly in any moment when you're not fully engaged with something in the external world. This is why the experience of being alone with your thoughts, for many people, is not peaceful but uncomfortable. The default mode, given free rein, tends to take the most well-worn paths, which are often the most painful ones. Mindfulness meditation, specifically, has been shown to reduce the hyperactivity of the default mode network, to quiet the self-referential cycling that characterizes rumination. This is one reason why meditation is a core element of the Level 2 and Level 3 protocols, not because contemplative practice is inherently valuable in all traditions, but because it has a measurable effect on the specific neural system most responsible for the patterns this book is targeting. Why negative patterns feel more true. One of the most confusing aspects of entrenched negative patterns is how convincing they feel. Not just frequent, but correct. The anxiety doesn't just show up, it arrives with evidence. The self-critical voice doesn't just criticize, it cites specific past failures. The worst-case scenario doesn't just appear, it feels like clear-headed realism. This is the work of negativity bias, one of the most well-documented phenomena in human psychology. The brain does not treat all information equally. From an evolutionary standpoint, missing a positive experience, a ripe fruit, a potential mate, a pleasant social interaction, carries a much lower cost than missing a negative one, a predator, a contaminated food source, a hostile group member. The brain therefore evolved to weight negative information more heavily, to attend to it more readily, process it more deeply, remember it more reliably, and return to it more frequently. This asymmetry shows up throughout human cognition. Negative events are remembered more vividly and in more detail than positive ones. Negative feedback is processed more thoroughly and persists longer. Criticism has greater emotional impact than equivalent praise. The brain builds more elaborate neural representations of negative experiences, which means those representations are more easily triggered, more readily accessed, and more difficult to update. The practical consequence is that your negative patterns don't just feel habitual, they feel true. The rumination feels like problem solving. The self-criticism feels like self-awareness. The worst-case thinking feels like prudence. This is one of the primary reasons people find it so hard to change these patterns. It's not just that they're automatic, it's that they feel accurate. You're not just fighting a habit, you're fighting the brain's tendency to present its most used negative pathways as objective reality. One of the things the practices in this book are specifically designed to do is create enough observational distance from your patterns that you can begin to see them as patterns rather than as accurate reports about reality. Not to deny that the anxiety points to something real, not to dismiss the self-criticism as entirely baseless, but to notice that the confidence with which these thoughts arrive is a product of their frequency of activation, not a measure of their accuracy. Frequent is not the same as true. Automatic is not the same as correct. What chronic stress does to the architecture. There is a darker dimension to the brain's plasticity when it comes to stress. chronic stress doesn't just activate stress responses, it physically changes the brain's structure in ways that make stress responses more likely. The amygdala is the brain's primary threat detection center, the structure that evaluates incoming sensory information for danger and triggers the fear and stress response. Research, including work by neuroscientist Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, has shown that chronic stress causes the amygdala to grow denser, to develop more synaptic connections and become more reactive. An amygdala shaped by chronic stress is, quite literally, a hair trigger. It detects threats more readily, activates the stress response faster, and takes longer to return to baseline. At the same time, chronic stress has the opposite effect on the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, the seat of rational thought, impulse control, long-term planning, and emotional regulation. Under sustained stress, the prefrontal cortex actually loses synaptic density. Its capacity for deliberate, controlled thought is physically compromised. This is why people under chronic stress find it harder to make decisions, harder to regulate their emotions, and harder to interrupt automatic patterns. Their neural hardware for doing so has been structurally weakened. The hippocampus, critical for memory formation, contextual learning, and the regulation of the stress response itself, is also vulnerable to chronic stress. McEwen's research showed that sustained elevated cortisol can actually cause hippocampal neurons to retract their dendritic branches, reducing the hippocampus's processing capacity. Given that the hippocampus is involved in learning new patterns and contextualizing emotional memories, its compromise under chronic stress makes the very process of rewiring neurologically harder. This is a vicious cycle. Stress strengthens the reactive brain and weakens the deliberate brain, which makes it harder to manage stress, which generates more stress, which further strengthens the reactive pathways. Many people are living in exactly this cycle, not because they lack the character to change, but because the physical state of their brain has made deliberate change neurologically much harder. The protocols in Part 3 address this directly. Several of the core practices, exercise, sleep, mindfulness, reduced chronic stimulation, are specifically targeted at reversing this structural damage, strengthening the prefrontal cortex, calming the amygdala, restoring hippocampal health, and breaking the cortisol cycle that maintains the chronic stress state. This is why those practices are not optional add-ons to the rewiring work. They are the rewiring work. Without addressing the neurological conditions that maintain the default patterns, the behavioral and cognitive practices are fighting against their own substrate. Why motivation and willpower aren't enough here is the explanation for a frustration almost everyone has experienced. You can clearly want to change a pattern, deeply and sincerely, and still find yourself repeating it moments later. The reason is anatomical. Willpower and deliberate decision-making operate primarily through the prefrontal cortex. This is the brain's newest, most evolutionarily recent structure, the part that can think about the future, weigh competing options, override impulse, and choose a response that isn't automatic. Using it is cognitively expensive. It requires active engagement, consumes glucose, and fatigues over time. The phenomenon of decision fatigue, the documented deterioration of decision quality after extended periods of decision-making, is essentially the prefrontal cortex running low on fuel. Habits, on the other hand, operate primarily through the basal ganglia, a much older, more deeply embedded set of brain structures that store procedural routines and run them automatically, without requiring conscious direction. The basal ganglia is metabolically cheap, extraordinarily efficient, and largely immune to the influence of conscious decision-making in the moment. It does not respond to intentions, motivations, or resolutions. It responds to cues that match its stored routines. When your entrenched pattern activates, when the trigger fires and the automatic response begins, it is being executed by the basal ganglia. Your prefrontal cortex may simultaneously be generating the thought, "I shouldn't react this way," but the basal ganglia has already launched the sequence. The habit fires faster than the deliberate thought can intervene. This is not a failure of character. It is a description of how the two systems interact. Motivation creates the intention to change. Willpower can, sometimes, interrupt a pattern in the moment. But neither motivation nor willpower rewires the basal ganglia. The only thing that rewires the basal ganglia is new repetition, replacing the old habit loop with a new one, practiced enough times that the new sequence becomes the automatic response. Charles Duhigg, in his exploration of habit research and the power of habit, described this as the habit loop, the cue, routine, reward cycle that the basal ganglia uses to encode automatic behaviors. The key insight from this framework is that habit change doesn't occur by eliminating the cue or willing away the routine. It occurs by keeping the cue, keeping the reward, and inserting a new routine in between. The cue fires, as it always has. Instead of the old automatic response, a new response is practiced deliberately, consistently, until the new response becomes the basal ganglia's preferred answer to that particular cue. This is why the protocols in Part 3 are structured around specific triggers and planned responses. Not vague intentions to be different, but specific plans. When X happens, I do Y instead of Z. When the loop starts, I use the physical interrupt. When the reactive surge begins, I take the breath and say, I need a moment. The specificity is not administrative fussiness. It is neurological strategy, giving the basal ganglia the cue routine pairing it needs to build a new automatic response. Practical reflection. These questions are designed to help you see your own defaults with more precision. Take 10 minutes with them and write your answers rather than just thinking through them. Think about a recurring pattern in your life, a way you respond to stress, criticism, uncertainty, or conflict that you've noticed happening again and again. Describe the pattern in behavioral terms, not I get anxious, but when X happens, I do Y. What is the trigger? What is the automatic response? What happens after the automatic response? What is the reward the brain receives that has kept this pattern in place? When did this pattern first make sense? Most automatic patterns began as reasonable responses to a real situation. Emotional withdrawal made sense when you were young and vulnerable. Catastrophizing made sense when unpredictable things actually did go wrong. Overworking made sense when your self-worth depended on performance. What was the original context in which this pattern was formed? Can you trace it to a specific period, a specific set of circumstances? How does this pattern feel when it's happening? Does it feel like truth, like self-protection, like clear thinking? Does the anxiety feel like accurate threat detection? Does the self-criticism feel like helpful standards? Does the avoidance feel like wisdom? That feeling of rightness, that sense that the pattern is not a pattern but just reality, is the brain presenting its most used pathway as objective fact. Noticing the feeling without fully believing it is one of the first acts of neuroplasticity. Finally, what has this pattern cost you? Not in a global, vague sense specifically. What have you not done, not had, not become because this pattern has been running the show? That cost is not evidence that you're broken. It's evidence that the rewiring is worth doing. Chapter 3, The Pattern Audit. In 1985, a psychologist named Walter Mischel published what became one of the most cited and most misunderstood bodies of research in the history of personality psychology. The famous marshmallow studies, conducted at Stanford in the late 1960s and 70s, measured 4-year-olds' ability to delay gratification. Could they wait 15 minutes to receive 2 marshmallows instead of eating the one in front of them immediately? The popular version of the story focuses on that result, on the children who waited and the ones who didn't. But what Mischel and his colleagues found in the decades of follow-up research was something considerably more interesting and considerably more uncomfortable. The children who struggled with delay of gratification at age 4 showed up decades later with measurably different life outcomes across a remarkable range of domains: educational attainment, professional stability, relationship quality, health behaviors. Not perfectly predictive. Not determinist. But statistically consistent in ways that were difficult to explain away. Mischel spent much of his later career arguing, correctly, that this was not evidence of fixed destiny. The self-control deficit, he demonstrated, was a learnable skill. It depended heavily on the strategies available to the child, not some immutable capacity they were born with. A child taught to think of the marshmallow as a cloud rather than food could wait significantly longer than the same child given no strategy at all. The pattern was changeable. But it was also real, and it ran deeper than people found comfortable to acknowledge. What his research made unmistakable was something this book keeps returning to: patterns run deep, they run early, and they run consistently in ways that most people do not see because they are inside the pattern looking out. This chapter is about getting outside your pattern and looking at it clearly. The 4 profiles of entrenched mental patterns in the clinical literature, in the research on rumination, emotional regulation, and behavioral psychology, and in the practical experience of people doing serious self-examination work, for patterns show up with particular frequency and particular consistency. They are not personality types in any rigid or pathologizing sense. Most people have elements of more than one. But they tend to have a primary profile that exerts the most influence on daily life, creates the most consistent friction, and has proven most resistant to general self-improvement efforts. Understanding which pattern dominates for you is not an act of labeling or limiting. It is an act of precision. Because the rewiring approach that works for a ruminator is different from the one that works for a reactor, and the work a self-saboteur needs to do is distinct from the work an avoider needs. Getting this wrong, applying a generic, just be more positive framework to what is actually a deeply embedded avoidance pattern, is one of the primary reasons general self-improvement advice fails so often. The mechanism is right, but the target is wrong. A map is only useful if it reflects the actual territory. Profile 1, the ruminator. The ruminator's dominant experience is repetitive thought. Not productive problem-solving, circular replaying. The same conversation revisited 17 times with slightly different variations. The same worry that appeared at 2 a.m. 3 weeks ago and has not fully left since. The mental rehearsal of possible future disasters that are vivid and specific and feel like preparation but are actually a form of sophisticated self-torture that produces no resolution, only more material for further rumination. Susan Nolen-Hoeksema, the Yale psychologist whose decades of research on rumination changed how clinical psychology understood depression and anxiety, defined rumination as a mode of responding to distress that involves repetitively and passively focusing on symptoms of distress and on the possible causes and consequences of these symptoms. The key word is passively. Rumination is not active problem solving, it is passive cycling through material that doesn't change because the thinking is going nowhere. The ruminator knows this, usually. They are often acutely aware that they're going in circles. And they keep going anyway, because the brain interprets the repetition as progress, as if thinking about the problem hard enough will eventually resolve it. From the inside, ruminative thinking feels like thoroughness. It feels responsible, like you're taking things seriously. It can masquerade as conscientiousness, I'm just being careful, or as empathy for others, I'm just concerned about them. The ruminator is often a person who is genuinely thoughtful, who cares deeply, who wants to understand the full complexity of situations before acting. These are real qualities. The problem is when the thoughtfulness tips into cycling, when the thinking stops producing new insight and simply revisits old territory with diminishing returns and increasing distress. The telltale sign is that the thinking does not produce resolution. It produces more thinking. The loop has no exit built in. And unlike genuine deliberation, which terminates when a decision is reached, rumination continues regardless of any decision because the underlying anxiety that drives it is not about the specific question being turned over but about something deeper, the need to feel safe, certain, or in control in a situation that feels fundamentally unsafe or uncertain. Ruminators often describe lying in bed with their mind refusing to stop, replaying the events of the day, particularly interactions that went badly or ambiguously. They frequently catastrophize futures they know are statistically unlikely, but whose vividness makes them feel probable. They often have difficulty fully engaging with the present moment because a significant portion of their mental bandwidth is running in the background, processing things that already happened or haven't happened yet. They may be physically present in a conversation while mentally rehearsing a different conversation that hasn't happened yet, or rerunning one that has. The physical cost is substantial. As Nolen-Hoeksema's research documented, chronic rumination keeps the stress response activated, the body remains in a low-grade state of alert even when no external threat is present. Cortisol remains elevated. Sleep is disrupted. The hippocampus, which consolidates memory and learning, is impaired by chronic cortisol. Over time, the ruminator's brain literally adapts to its own rumination, the pathways that run the loop become smoother, faster, more automatic. What began as a response to a specific difficult situation becomes the brain's default response to any ambiguity or uncertainty. Profile 2, the reactor. The reactor's dominant experience is being overtaken by emotion before their conscious mind has had any say in the matter. The amygdala fires first and the prefrontal cortex catches up later, often too late, after the damage is done. Reactors recognize themselves in the experience of saying something in an argument that they immediately knew was wrong, but couldn't stop. In the sensation of a flash of rage, or humiliation, or panic that arrived so fast it felt like it happened to them rather than through them. In the aftermath, the apology, the regret, the genuine bewilderment that they did it again when they had promised themselves, clearly and sincerely, that they wouldn't. There is often a quality of watching themselves from a slight remove, already aware of what's happening but unable to intervene in time. The reactor pattern is often most visible in close relationships, because it is in close relationships where the stakes are highest, where the history is richest, and where the emotional triggers are most deeply embedded that automatic emotional responses have the most room to do damage. A reactor can function with remarkable composure in neutral environments and completely lose that composure with the people who matter most to them. This can produce a particularly painful form of confusion. They are competent, controlled, even-keeled in professional and social settings, and then explosive or shut down in the places where they most want to show up well. What makes this pattern particularly difficult is its speed. The emotional hijack, a term Daniel Goleman popularized in his work on emotional intelligence, can occur in milliseconds, long before the conscious mind can intervene. The reactor is not slow to think. They're fast to feel, and the feeling arrives with such force that it bypasses the thinking entirely. The cost of the reactor pattern shows up not just in the reactive episodes themselves but in what accumulates around them, the relationships that become structured around managing the reactivity, the professional situations where the reactor's emotional volatility prevents advancement or damages authority, the self-narrative of someone who keeps failing at the thing they most care about. Reactors are often profoundly remorseful. That remorse, if it tips into rumination and self-criticism, can begin to blend the reactor pattern with the ruminator pattern, creating cycles of reaction, self-recrimination, and anxiety about the next reaction that are among the most exhausting configurations the mind can produce. Profile 3, the avoider. The avoider's dominant pattern is withdrawal from challenge, discomfort, confrontation, or any situation that carries the risk of failure or rejection. Where the ruminator stays in the loop and the reactor explodes through it, the avoider sidesteps the loop entirely by refusing to engage with the situation that triggers it. Avoidance looks different in different people. In some, it's dramatic and visible, a refusal to pursue goals, to take risks, to attempt anything with a meaningful probability of failure. These avoiders stay in jobs that are too small for them, relationships that are comfortable but not growth-producing, lives that are safe in ways that are quietly devastating. In others, avoidance is subtle and sophisticated and expert at appearing engaged while actually maintaining careful emotional distance. A person who is universally liked because they never disagree, never need anything, never create friction, and who is, inside, completely isolated. The pleasant surface is the avoidance. The ease everyone experiences is the cost being paid by the person beneath it. What makes avoidance so tenacious is that it works, in the short term. Avoiding the uncomfortable conversation does relieve the anxiety of that conversation temporarily. Not applying for the position you want does protect you from the possibility of rejection immediately. The brain receives a clean reinforcement signal, avoidance relief. And because avoidance reliably produces short-term relief, the basal ganglia files it as the correct response to the triggering situation. The pattern deepens with every successful avoidance. The long-term cost is compounding. Every avoided challenge is evidence, to the part of your brain that tracks your own competence and worth, that you couldn't handle it. Every avoided conversation is a relationship that stays shallower than it could be. Every avoided risk is a life that stays smaller than your actual capacity. The avoider often knows this with painful clarity. They can articulate, with great sophistication, exactly what they're doing and exactly what it costs them. The awareness doesn't help, because the anxiety that avoidance relieves is real and immediate, while the cost of avoidance is abstract and future-facing. Profile 4, the self-saboteur. The self-saboteur's pattern is the most counterintuitive, and often the most painful to identify, because it involves undermining precisely what you most want. Things go well, a relationship deepens into genuine intimacy, a career gains real momentum, a period of personal growth is clearly and measurably underway, and then something happens. You provoke the conflict that damages the relationship. You make the decision that derails the professional trajectory. You stop doing the practices that were making you feel better. You do the thing you promised yourself, and promised others, you would not do. It is tempting to explain this as simple self-destructiveness, or as evidence of some fundamental flaw in the person. But that framing misses the actual mechanism, and missing the mechanism means the pattern never changes. Self-sabotage most commonly arises from one of two sources: unconscious beliefs about what you deserve, or unconscious fear of the unfamiliar, including, counterintuitively, the unfamiliar good. If your internal model of yourself is built around inadequacy, failure, or unworthiness, if the story your brain has been running for years is that you are someone who eventually disappoints, then success creates cognitive dissonance. The good outcome doesn't fit the self-narrative. The relationship is better than what you believe you deserve. The career achievement is higher than what you've mentally filed yourself as capable of. And the brain, which is fundamentally a pattern completion machine, always working to resolve inconsistencies between expectation and reality, resolves the dissonance by returning to the familiar. The self-narrative about who you are is stronger, in that moment, than the evidence of what you've achieved. Alternatively, some self-sabotage is about managing threat. Success raises the stakes. A better relationship means more to lose. A career that's flourishing means more visibility, more expectation, more possibility of a public fall. For someone whose nervous system is organized around avoiding vulnerability and managing risk, success is threatening in a specific and identifiable way, and the self-sabotage is, paradoxically, a return to safety. Better to collapse it yourself, on your terms, than to let it grow and risk losing it in an uncontrolled way. From the inside, the self-saboteur often experiences their behavior as compulsive, as inexplicable decisions they watch themselves make without understanding why, or as a sudden conviction that was overwhelming in the moment and completely mysterious in retrospect. They are frequently articulate about their patterns after the fact and frustratingly blind to them in the moment when the pattern is executing. Identifying your primary pattern: most people reading this will recognize themselves in more than one profile. The ruminator who also avoids. The reactor who also self-sabotages. The avoider whose avoidance is driven by ruminative fear of what might happen if they engage. The self-saboteur who reacts impulsively in the moments that matter most. These combinations are common and normal. They reflect the complexity of human pattern systems and the way different patterns can reinforce and amplify each other. But there is almost always a primary pattern, the one that creates the most consistent friction in your life, that shows up across the most contexts, that you've been aware of the longest, and that has proven most resistant to previous attempts at change. Identifying the primary pattern is the starting point, because it determines the most useful rewiring focus. A useful diagnostic: where does your recurring suffering happen? If it's in your head, in the loops, the replaying, the worry that won't stop, your primary pattern is likely ruminative. If it's in the aftermath of intense emotional moments, in the wreckage of things you said or did while overwhelmed, your primary pattern is likely reactive. If it's in the quiet gap between the life you have and the life you imagine, in the things you never quite do, the risks you always stop short of, your primary pattern is likely avoidance. And if you find yourself returning to smaller lives and broken things just as good things were beginning, self-sabotage is doing most of the work. One more indicator: which pattern do you find yourself most reluctant to name? The one that feels most like just how I am rather than a pattern is often the primary one, precisely because it is so deeply embedded that it has become invisible by proximity. Practical reflection below is a self-scoring audit. For each question, score yourself from 1, rarely or never true of me, to 5, almost always true of me. Answer based on your actual behavior and experience, not on how you think you should be or how you are at your best. Honesty here is the entire point. Ruminator score: when something difficult happens, I find myself thinking about it repeatedly even when I consciously want to stop. I often replay conversations in my head afterward, wondering if I said the wrong thing, how it was received, or what the other person really meant. When I try to fall asleep, my mind tends to be active with thoughts about things that happened or things that might happen. Reactor score: I sometimes say or do things in moments of strong emotion that I later regret and wish I could take back. When I feel criticized, dismissed, or disrespected, my emotional response is fast and intense, often faster and more intense than I can comfortably manage. People close to me have told me that I overreact, that my emotional responses can be unpredictable, or that they're sometimes afraid to bring certain things up. Avoider score: I frequently put off difficult conversations that I know need to happen, finding reasons to delay even when I can see the cost of delay. When I face a challenge where failure is possible, I often find myself pulling back, finding reasons not to try, or reframing the challenge as not important. I tend to keep people at a certain emotional distance, even in relationships where I trust and care about the other person. Self-saboteurs score when things are going well. I sometimes feel a vague anxiety or restlessness that leads me to make decisions that disrupt the good thing. I have noticed a pattern of getting close to something I want, a goal, a relationship, a level of professional success, and then doing something that undermines it. I often feel that success is something that happens to other people, and when it begins to happen to me, something in me questions whether I deserve it or whether it will last. Add your scores for each category. Your highest score identifies your primary pattern. If two scores are very close, consider which of the two creates more daily friction, more recurring regret, and more consistent limitation in your life. That is likely your primary. Write your primary pattern down explicitly. Name it. Not to define yourself permanently, but to give yourself a precise target. The rewiring protocols in Part 3 are most effective when you know exactly what you're rewiring, in what situations it appears, and what it has been costing you. Chapter 4, The Thought Loop Problem. In the early 1990s, Yale psychologist Susan Nolen-Hoeksema was trying to understand something that clinical observation had made obvious but theory had not adequately explained: why some people who experienced depression recovered relatively quickly, while others equally intelligent, equally capable, often with equivalent life circumstances, stayed depressed for months and years. She suspected the answer had something to do with what people did with their thoughts, not just what thoughts they had. What she found, through a series of careful longitudinal studies, changed how clinical psychology understood depression and anxiety. The people who stayed depressed longer were not people who had worse problems or weaker character. They were people who, in response to difficult feelings, ruminated, who turned their attention inward and repetitively focused on their distress, its possible causes, and its possible consequences. The people who recovered more quickly were those who, by training or by temperament, could redirect attention toward action, toward distraction, toward engagement with the world outside their own heads. This finding was replicated across contexts. Nolen-Hoeksema found that ruminators were more likely to develop depression after stressful life events, more likely to experience longer depressive episodes, more likely to develop alcohol problems, using alcohol as an interruption of the loop, and more likely to experience worse interpersonal relationships. The rumination was not just a symptom of difficulty, it was a driver of it. And it was not character. It was a cognitive style, a practiced pattern of engaging with distress that could, in principle, be changed. Nolen-Hoeksema's research made something clear that most of us know intuitively but rarely act on: the repetitive thought loop is not neutral. It is not just uncomfortable. It is actively making things worse. Every revolution of the loop deepens the very distress it is ostensibly trying to resolve. And at the neurological level, that deepening is literal. What the loop is doing to your brain when you engage in repetitive thinking about a painful or stressful topic: you are activating a specific constellation of neural pathways, the ones associated with that topic, that emotion, that self-narrative. And as you know from Chapter 1, every activation of a pathway strengthens it. The more you run the loop, the stronger those connections become. The more efficient the pathway, the more easily it is triggered in the future. The more easily it is triggered, the more often you find yourself in the loop without having consciously chosen to be there. This is the neurological dimension of what Nolen-Hoeksema observed clinically. Rumination is self-reinforcing not just psychologically but structurally. You are, in the most literal sense, practicing your anxiety, practicing your self-criticism, practicing your despair. The brain doesn't distinguish between wanted and unwanted repetition. Neurons that fire together wire together, regardless of whether firing feels good. The implication is uncomfortable but important. Every thought loop you allow to run to completion without interruption is a small investment in making that loop easier to enter next time. Across weeks, months, and years of this, a thought loop that began as a response to a specific difficult event can become a neurological highway, a default destination the brain routes to under almost any condition of stress or uncertainty, independent of whether the original event is still relevant. Many people are living with thought loops that were constructed around experiences that are genuinely over relationships that ended years ago, professional failures that have been superseded by subsequent achievements, social rejections from people they no longer know or care about. The original event that built the loop has passed. But because the loop was never interrupted and rewired, it continues to fire, continues to strengthen. Continues to be the brain's automatic response to situations that only superficially resemble the original trigger. You encounter criticism at work in your 30s and the loop that activates was built in response to a parent's criticism when you were 11. The present situation is different. The neural pathway doesn't know or care about that difference. The cortisol cost. There is a physical dimension to thought loops that deserves its own attention, because it is one of the least understood and most significant costs of chronic rumination. When you engage in a thought loop centered on threat, a feared outcome, a source of shame, a conflict, a possible failure, your brain treats that mental content as a real threat in the present moment. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activates. Cortisol is released. The stress response that evolved to handle immediate physical danger, flooding the body with energy for fight or flight, sharpening attention to the threat, suppressing processes not immediately necessary for survival, is triggered by a thought that exists only in your mind. The body does not know the difference between a mental threat and a physical one. The cortisol response is the same. The elevated heart rate is the same. The suppression of digestion, the narrowing of attention, the heightening of threat detection, all of it occurs in response to a thought as fully as it would occur in response to a predator. The immune system, the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, and the sleep architecture are all affected by the cortisol release produced by a thought loop that never touches the external world. For a thought loop that runs for 20 minutes, you have 20 minutes of stress response. For a thought loop that loops several times a day, you have effectively continuous stress response activation. For a pattern that has run this way for years, you are looking at chronically elevated cortisol, and the consequences of that are not subtle. Chronic cortisol elevation suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep architecture, damages cardiovascular health, impairs memory and concentration, and, as we discussed in Chapter 2, physically alters the structure of the brain in ways that make you more reactive and less capable of deliberate control. The hippocampus, whose health is essential for building new neural pathways, is directly damaged by chronic cortisol. This is the recursive tragedy of the thought loop. The loop produces cortisol that compromises the prefrontal cortex's ability to interrupt the loop, which allows the loop to run longer and produce more cortisol, which further compromises the prefrontal cortex. Understanding this cycle is not an invitation to despair, it is an explanation for why the loop feels so much more powerful than you do, and why the physical interrupts in the protocols matter so much. Changing the body's physiological state is often the fastest available route out of the cycle. What breaking a loop actually looks like here is what most people get wrong when they try to stop a thought loop. They try to stop it by arguing with it. They counter the catastrophic thought with the rational evidence for why it's unlikely. They remind themselves that the thing they're worrying about has a 90% probability of not happening. They deploy the thought loop against itself, which, because they are activating the same pathways in the process, often strengthens those pathways rather than weakening them. The attempt to reason with the loop feeds the loop. Daniel Wegner's famous white bear research demonstrated the irony effect in thought suppression. The deliberate attempt to not think about something makes you think about it more, because the monitoring process that checks whether you're thinking about it keeps activating the very representation you're trying to suppress. Direct suppression is neurologically self-defeating. What actually interrupts a thought loop, neurologically, is something different: attentional redirection. Not suppression, but deliberate movement of attention towards something specific, present, and engaging enough to genuinely occupy the neural circuits that the loop was using. When you redirect attention, you deactivate the ruminative pathway and activate a different network. You interrupt the cortisol cycle by interrupting the threat perception. You give the loop an opportunity to settle. Research by James Gross at Stanford, who has studied emotion regulation extensively, identifies two families of strategies that work and two that don't. What works: attentional deployment, deliberately redirecting where attention goes, and cognitive reappraisal, genuinely reconsidering the meaning of the situation, not just arguing with the anxiety. What doesn't work: suppression, trying not to feel the emotion, and venting, repeatedly expressing the emotion without resolution, which strengthens the pathway rather than releasing it. Physical pattern interruption is often the most reliable initial method, particularly for people whose loops are deeply established. This is why the protocols in Part 3 include cold water, physical movement, and change of environment as first response tools when a loop begins. The body and brain are in continuous dialogue. Change the physical state and you interrupt the neural state. A 60-second burst of cold water on the face, a brisk 5-minute walk, a deliberate change of physical location, these are not naive suggestions. They are neurologically grounded interventions that change the brain's signal environment quickly enough to break the momentum of a loop. They work by activating the body's orienting response, the automatic attentional reorientation to a significant new stimulus, which competes with the default mode's loop running. Recovery, shortening the loop, not eliminating the thought. One of the most important reframes in this chapter is about what realistic recovery from a thought loop problem actually looks like. Getting this wrong produces impossible expectations and unnecessary discouragement. The goal is not to become someone who never has the thoughts. If you have a ruminating brain, the thoughts will appear. The anxiety will surface. The self-critical voice will speak. This is not a failure of rewiring, it is a normal feature of having a brain shaped by years of this pattern, operating in the same world that originally produced the pattern. The thoughts are not the problem. The relationship to the thoughts is the problem. The goal is to shorten the loop. Where you once entered the loop and stayed in it for 2 hours, you exit after 20 minutes. Where 20 minutes was the floor, it becomes 5. Where 5 minutes was the floor, the thought arrives, is noticed, is not elaborated, and passes. Not through suppression, through the combination of recognition, non-engagement, and redirection that comes from genuine rewiring. This is what recovery looks like in practice, not silence but speed. Not the absence of the thought but the collapse of its duration. Not the impossibility of the loop but the reduction of its grip. You still notice the familiar pull, the tug toward the worry, the starting of the familiar replay, but the tug doesn't catch you. You have enough attentional flexibility to notice it without following it. That moment of noticing without following is what neuroplasticity looks like in lived experience. Small, undramatic, and completely real. Neuroscientist Judson Brewer, whose research at Brown University focuses on the neuroscience of habit and craving, has found that curiosity is one of the most powerful stances for interrupting ruminative loops. Instead of fighting the thought or reasoning with it, approaching it with a kind of curious, non-reactive observation, there it is again, interesting, activates different neural pathways than either engagement or suppression. It creates a slight but crucial distance between the observer and the observed, between you and the thought that had been presenting itself as you. Brewer's work on mindfulness and craving showed that this curious observational stance, what he calls curiosity and kindness toward difficult mental states, actually reduced the brain's habit-reinforcing reward signals associated with those states. By deromanticizing the loop, seeing it as just a pattern the brain is running, rather than as profound truth-telling about the situation, the loop loses some of its magnetic pull. The distance is not spiritual abstraction. It is measurable neural difference. It is the prefrontal cortex observing what the default mode network is doing, rather than simply being run by it. The stories the loop tells. Every thought loop carries a story, a narrative about you, the world, other people, or what's going to happen. These narratives are often so familiar, so well rehearsed, that they feel like facts rather than interpretations. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds at things like this. People like me don't get that. If I try and it doesn't work, I will be exposed as someone who always fails. They never really respected me. Nothing I do is ever enough. These are not facts. They are the content of heavily reinforced neural pathways, running with such efficiency that they arrive with the authority of truth. The confidence with which these thoughts arrive is a product of their frequency, not their accuracy. Aaron Beck, the psychiatrist who developed cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most empirically supported forms of psychotherapy ever developed, identified these automatic negative thoughts as the surface expression of deeper core beliefs, fundamental assumptions about self and world that had been installed through experience and were now running automatically, interpreting every new situation through their lens. Beck's model suggested that cognitive change required working at the level of these core beliefs, not just the surface thoughts, that catching and replacing the automatic thought without addressing the underlying belief would produce only temporary relief. This is the thought loop in its full architecture, not just a thought, but a thought connected to a story, connected to a core belief, connected to an emotional response, connected to a behavioral consequence. The thought loop about the meeting that went badly isn't just about the meeting. It's connected to the story that your competence is perpetually in question, which is connected to the core belief that you are fundamentally inadequate, which generates the anxiety that triggers more vigilance for evidence of inadequacy, which finds that evidence everywhere, which produces more loops. Rewiring at the level of the surface thought without addressing the story and the belief is one reason why purely cognitive interventions sometimes produce only partial or temporary relief. Part 3's protocols, particularly the Level 3 Deep Resets cognitive reframing practice, address this at the level of core beliefs, not just surface thoughts. For now, what matters is recognizing the story your loop tells, and beginning to see it as a story rather than a report. Practical reflection. This reflection is specifically structured to map your most active thought loops with precision. Take at least 20 minutes with this. The quality of what you map here will directly inform how you approach the protocols in Part 3. Write your answers. Identify your top 3 recurring thought loops. These are the thoughts or thought patterns that show up most regularly, the ones you recognize immediately as, there it is again. Write each one down as specifically as you can. Not anxiety about the future, but the thought that I will eventually be exposed as incompetent at work and lose everything I've built. Not ruminating about relationships, but replaying the argument with my partner about money and rehearsing how I should have responded differently. The specificity is not pedantic, it reflects the way the loop actually lives in your experience. For each thought loop, identify the trigger. What reliably starts the loop? Is it a particular time of day, often late night or early morning, when the prefrontal cortex is least active and the default mode has the least competition? A particular physical state, tired, hungry, under pressure, after alcohol? A particular social context, after a tense interaction, before an important event, in unstructured time? The trigger is the cue in the habit loop. Knowing it precisely allows you to anticipate the loop rather than being ambushed by it. For each thought loop, identify what it tells you. What is the story it carries? What does it say about you, about others, about what is likely to happen? What is the core belief underneath the surface thought? This part is harder. It requires sitting with the loop long enough to hear its actual message, not just its surface content. Finally, for each thought loop, identify what it costs you. Not philosophically, practically. What would you have done with those 2 hours you spent in the loop? How does the residue of the loop affect your behavior, your presence, your relationships, your energy for the rest of the day? What are you not building, not experiencing, not offering to the people around you because the loop is consuming the bandwidth? This mapping is not an exercise in self-criticism. It is cartography. You cannot navigate unfamiliar territory without a map. The loops you've identified are the precise neural highways you'll be redirecting in Part 3. The more accurately you've mapped them, the more precisely you can target the rewiring. Chapter 5, The Emotional Reactivity Problem. There is a scene that plays out with remarkable consistency across relationships, workplaces, and families around the world. A conversation is going reasonably well. Then something is said, a word, a tone, a look, and the dynamic changes instantly. The person on the receiving end says something they will later regret, or shuts down completely, or escalates in a way that transforms a manageable disagreement into something that takes days to repair. And afterward, in the quiet, they'll say, I don't know why I do that. I know better. I just couldn't stop. This is the emotional reactivity problem. Not a problem of knowledge. Reactive people are often fully aware of what they're doing and why it's counterproductive. Not a problem of motivation. Reactive people typically want, deeply and sincerely, to respond differently. The problem is timing. The emotional response arrives so fast, with such force, that the conscious mind is simply not in the room when it happens. This chapter is about understanding that timing problem at the neurological level, not to excuse the behavior it produces, but to explain it accurately enough that you can finally address it effectively. Because if you don't understand what's actually happening when the hijack occurs, all the best intentions in the world will keep producing the same frustrating result. The amygdala hijack. In 1995, Daniel Goleman introduced the concept of the amygdala hijack in his landmark book Emotional Intelligence, drawing on the foundational neuroscience of Joseph Ledoux at New York University. The term describes what happens when the amygdala, the brain's threat detection and emotional processing center, activates a full stress response before the signal has had time to travel through the prefrontal cortex, where rational evaluation and impulse control happen. The neuroscience behind this is precise. When sensory information enters the brain, it takes two routes simultaneously. The first, the low road, in Ledoux's terminology, goes directly from the thalamus to the amygdala. It is fast, rough, and automatic. It produces an emotional response before the signal has been fully evaluated. The second route, the high road, travels from the thalamus through the sensory cortex, where it is processed with more nuance and context, and then on to the prefrontal cortex, where it can be evaluated, compared against past experience, and responded to deliberately. The high road is slower, by a matter of milliseconds in some cases, but milliseconds that can determine whether a response is chosen or automatic. In situations the amygdala registers as threatening, situations that resemble past experiences of danger, rejection, humiliation, or loss, the emotional response via the low road fires in milliseconds. By the time the high road has finished its slower, more careful evaluation, the reaction has already begun. The prefrontal cortex may receive the signal that the situation isn't actually as threatening as it seemed, but it's receiving that message while the body is already flooding with adrenaline and the mouth is already opening. Ledoux's research illuminated something crucial. The amygdala has access to memories of past emotional experiences that the conscious mind may not easily recall. This is why triggers can seem disproportionate, why a particular tone of voice, a specific word, a certain quality of silence can produce an emotional response that seems wildly out of scale with the apparent situation. The amygdala has matched the current input against a stored emotional memory, from early childhood, from a past relationship, from a time when a very similar input preceded something genuinely threatening, and activated the appropriate emergency response. The fact that the current context is different from the stored context doesn't matter to the amygdala. Pattern match, response executed. This is not a design flaw. In an environment of genuine physical danger, having an emotional alarm system that fires faster than conscious thought is an enormous survival advantage. You don't want to deliberate when a predator lunges. The problem is that this same system is now being triggered by emails, traffic, a partner's tone of voice, a perceived slight from a colleague, stimuli that are emotionally significant but not physically dangerous, and that would benefit enormously from deliberate rather than automatic response. Reactivity is a learned pattern, not a fixed trait. Here is the thing that most people who identify as emotionally reactive don't know: reactivity is not a personality type. It is a pattern, which means it is a product of neural pathways that were built through experience and can, with sustained practice, be rebuilt. The amygdala's sensitivity is calibrated by experience. An amygdala that developed in an environment of chronic unpredictability, emotional volatility, or interpersonal threat becomes highly sensitized, calibrated to detect threat early, to respond fast, to err strongly on the side of activation over false dismissal. This calibration is adaptive in the original environment and maladaptive when carried into an adult life with different conditions. Research by neuroscientist Martin Teicher and others has documented how adverse early experiences produce measurable changes in amygdala structure and function, and, crucially, how those changes are not permanent. The brain's plasticity means that the same mechanism that shaped the amygdala through early experience can reshape it through adult experience. The amygdala can become less reactive. The prefrontal cortex can become stronger and more capable of early intervention. The window between stimulus and response can genuinely widen. This is not a guarantee of easy transformation. An amygdala shaped by years or decades of sensitization doesn't normalize in a week of deliberate practice. But the direction of change is real, and the tools for producing it are well established. Sustained mindfulness practice, shown in research including Sarah Lazar's Harvard studies, reduces amygdala reactivity and strengthens prefrontal regulation. Aerobic exercise reduces the size of the amygdala's threat response signature over time. Cognitive reappraisal training builds the neural pathways for re-evaluating a stimulus before responding to it. Consistent, adequate sleep consolidates emotional regulation learning and prevents the prefrontal cortex impairment that makes amygdala hijack more likely under fatigue. None of these interventions is fast. All of them are real. The cost of automatic reactions. Before we talk about changing reactivity, it's worth being honest about what unchecked reactivity costs, not as an act of judgment, but as a motivation for the difficult work of rewiring. In relationships, automatic reactivity is a consistent source of damage that compounds over time. The partner who escalates before the other person has finished their sentence. The parent whose anger arrives with a force disproportionate to what a child's behavior actually warrants. The friend who withdraws completely at the first sign of conflict. These are not people trying to hurt those they care about, they are people whose emotional responses are running faster than their intentions, and whose relationships bear the accumulated cost of that gap. What makes this particularly difficult in close relationships is the dynamic that develops around the reactive person's pattern. Partners, children, friends, and colleagues learn to navigate the reactivity, to monitor their own words and tone in anticipation of triggering, to avoid bringing up certain topics, to handle the reactive person with a care that gradually becomes exhausting. The reactive person may be unaware of the degree to which their relationships have been structured around managing their reactions. When the awareness arrives, when someone finally says, "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells," it can be devastating. Not because the relationship is broken, but because the cost has been higher than either person fully realized. In professional settings, emotional reactivity tends to produce specific failure patterns. The person who can't receive critical feedback without becoming defensive never improves in the ways their feedback is pointing to, because the defensive reaction closes off the information. The person whose anger in high-pressure situations damages their authority finds themselves increasingly isolated from honest input, surrounded by people who have learned to tell them only what won't trigger a reaction. The person whose anxiety, expressed reactively, makes other people feel they need to manage them rather than collaborate with them gets passed over for roles that require emotional steadiness under pressure. In the domain of decisions, reactivity is one of the most consistent drivers of poor choices. Reactive decisions, made in the heat of an emotional state, without the moderating influence of deliberate evaluation, tend to optimize for reducing immediate emotional discomfort rather than for actual good outcomes. The reactive resignation letter, written and sent in an hour of fury, that closes a door that would have been better left open. The reactive response to perceived disrespect that escalates a manageable conflict into an irreparable one. The reactive decision to end a relationship during an argument that would have looked entirely different in the morning. These are all the prefrontal cortex temporarily offline while the amygdala drives. Viktor Frankl and the space between stimulus and response. There is a quotation that has become widely attributed to Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, that sits at the heart of this chapter. Between stimulus and response there is a space, it reads. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Whether or not Frankl wrote these exact words, the attribution is debated among scholars. The idea is genuinely his, and it emerges from the most extreme possible conditions. Frankl spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. In his account of that experience, Man's Search for Meaning, he describes how even in conditions of total external captivity, where everything had been stripped away, where survival was arbitrary and suffering was the constant texture of existence, there remained a dimension of inner freedom that could not be taken, the freedom to choose one's inner response to external circumstances. This is not an argument for passive acceptance. Frankl was not suggesting that the response to injustice is equanimity. He was observing something that his conditions had made newly visible, that between what happens to you and what you do with it, there is a gap. And in that gap lives something irreducibly human, the capacity for chosen response rather than automatic reaction. For most people in less extreme circumstances, that gap is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a neurological reality that can be trained. The space between stimulus and response exists biologically. It is the time between the amygdala's initial signal and the prefrontal cortex's processing of that signal. In a highly reactive person, that gap is effectively invisible. The reaction arrives so fast that there is no experienced pause between trigger and response. In someone who has trained attentional awareness and emotional regulation through sustained practice, consistently applied, the gap is perceptible. They notice the emotional surge before acting on it. They have a moment, however brief, of observing the reaction rather than being entirely inside it. That noticing is not just psychological, it is the prefrontal cortex successfully intervening in the gap between stimulus and response. Frankl's insight, Translated into neurological terms, the space between stimulus and response is the prefrontal cortex's window of opportunity. Training that window to open, widening the gap through sustained practice, is the project of rewiring emotional reactivity. Not suppressing the emotion, not denying the validity of the response, but inserting enough of a pause that you get to choose what happens with the emotion rather than being carried by it before you've decided. How the rewiring protocols target reactivity. The protocols in Part 3, particularly Level 2 and Level 3, directly target the reactivity to pause gap through several specific mechanisms, each grounded in the neuroscience of emotional regulation. Visualization of the pause, practiced before the triggering situation occurs, is perhaps the most powerful single tool for reducing emotional reactivity. When you repeatedly imagine yourself in a triggering scenario and imagine yourself pausing, taking the breath, noticing the emotion, choosing the response, you are literally rehearsing the neural sequence you want to fire in the real situation. Research on mental rehearsal in athletes, surgical residents, and musicians consistently shows that imagined practice produces real neurological changes. The neural pathway for the pause grows stronger through imagined repetition. You're building the prefrontal cortex's pathway into the pause before you need it in the heat of the moment. Physical anchoring, specific physical interventions, like a slow exhalation, a particular hand position, or a brief physical withdrawal from the situation, interrupt the momentum of the reactive sequence and provide the few additional seconds the prefrontal cortex needs to catch up with the amygdala's initial signal. The slow exhalation is particularly well studied. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system directly, countering the sympathetic arousal of the stress response. The body and brain are in continuous dialogue, and changing the body's physiological state is one of the fastest available routes to changing the brain's emotional state. Post-reaction analysis, practiced without shame, builds the detailed self-knowledge that is the precondition for earlier intervention. Every reactive episode is data. After the heat has passed, reviewing the sequence: what was the exact trigger? What did the emotion feel like in the body before the reaction? What was the story the amygdala was running? What would the next 50 milliseconds of the new pathway have looked like? Creates the neural map of your specific reactivity landscape. The more precisely you know the shape of your triggers and your reactions, the earlier you can recognize the pattern beginning to fire, and the larger the available window for intervention. Mindfulness practice, consistently applied, directly targets the amygdala's hair trigger sensitivity. The mechanism is twofold. Repeated practice of non-reactive observation of emotional states teaches the brain that strong emotion can be noticed without immediate action, gradually reducing the urgency of the amygdala's threat signals. And sustained mindfulness practice, as Sarah Lazar's research documented, produces measurable reductions in amygdala volume and reactivity over time. Practical reflection. This reflection asks you to work backwards from specific recent events rather than generalizing. The specificity is important. The more precisely you can map past reactive episodes, the more accurately you can target the rewiring. Think of 3 situations in the last month where you reacted in a way you later regretted or wished you'd handled differently. For each one, work through these questions in writing. What was the exact trigger? Not the general category, a confrontation with my partner, but the precise moment when she said, "You never listen," in that particular tone of voice, with that particular look. The specificity matters because the amygdala is specific. It responds to particular signals, not general situations. The more precisely you can identify the trigger, the earlier you can recognize it when it appears in the future. What did the reaction feel like in your body, and where did you feel it first? Chest tightening? Heat in the face? A kind of narrowing of vision? A sudden deflation or heaviness? A sensation of rising temperature or physical constriction? The body always carries the emotion before the behavior. Learning to recognize the physical signature of your reactivity gives you the earliest possible warning signal. What was the story the amygdala was running? Not just the emotion, but the interpretation. What did the trigger mean, in that moment, to the part of your brain that fired the reaction? Was it a threat to your competence, your worth, your safety, your belonging? What past experience does this trigger rhyme with? Now imagine the pause, not a different response necessarily, but just the pause. What would have been available to you if the response had been delayed by 10 seconds? By 30 seconds? By 2 minutes? What new information might have arrived? What would you have chosen if you'd had the choice? This is not a hypothetical for self-blame. It's a rehearsal for the next time. Chapter 6: Rewiring in Your Relationships. In the 1960s and 70s, British psychiatrist John Bowlby developed a theory that would become one of the most consequential frameworks in developmental psychology. Attachment theory holds that the patterns of connection between infants and their primary caregivers, the ways those caregivers respond to the infant's needs for closeness, comfort, and security, create internal working models, mental templates for how relationships work, how trustworthy other people are, how much closeness is safe, and what to expect when you reach toward another person. These templates are wired early and run deep. And the evidence that they persist into adulthood is, at this point, overwhelming. Adult attachment researchers Mary Main and Philip Shaver documented how the same attachment patterns identified in infancy, secure, anxious, and avoidant, reappear in adult romantic relationships, with striking consistency. The person who was securely attached as an infant tends to approach adult relationships with a fundamental confidence in the availability of closeness. The person who is anxiously attached tends to monitor relationships with hypervigilance, seeking constant reassurance and interpreting ambiguity as threat. The person who is avoidantly attached tends to maintain emotional self-sufficiency as a default, finding the intensity of closeness uncomfortable and sometimes overwhelming. You are in your relationships right now with a brain that was shaped, in significant part, by the relationships you didn't choose, the ones you were born into, the ones that formed you before you could evaluate them. The patterns you identified in Chapter 3 do not exist only in your inner life. They show up most forcefully, most consistently, and most consequentially in how you relate to other people. This is where the neural defaults produce their most visible and most costly effects. How patterns show up in relationships. Every relationship pattern involves at least two people, but for the purpose of this chapter, we're going to focus on what you can observe and work with, your side of the pattern. That is the only side you can rewire. The ruminator's relationship pattern often involves prolonged post-interaction processing. The conversation with a friend, partner, or colleague has ended. For the ruminator, the processing continues for hours or days. What did they mean by that? Were they angry? Did I say the wrong thing? Am I reading too much into it, or not enough? This internal processing often creates a subtle but significant disconnection. The ruminator is physically present but mentally conducting an extended analysis of a conversation that the other person finished 20 minutes ago and has completely moved on from. Over time, partners and close friends of ruminators sometimes describe a quality of interacting with someone who was never quite fully there, who is always also somewhere else, processing something. The ruminator is often extremely attuned to nuance and very good at understanding other people's emotional states. These are real strengths. The problem is when the attunement tips into hypervigilance, when reading the room becomes constant surveillance for signs of disapproval or conflict, and when the post-conversation analysis strips the joy from even genuinely good interactions by subjecting them to endless review. The reactor's relationship pattern involves cycles that the other people in their life learn to navigate carefully. Partners of highly reactive people sometimes describe a quality of walking on eggshells, of monitoring their own words and tone in anticipation of possible triggering, and then experiencing guilt or resentment about that monitoring. The reactive person is often genuinely remorseful after episodes, which creates its own pattern: explosion, apology, reconciliation, quiet period, build up, explosion again. Both people become trained into the cycle until it feels, to both of them, like the natural texture of the relationship. The particularly painful dimension of the reactor pattern in relationships is that the people who trigger it most reliably are usually the people the reactor loves most. The amygdala's triggers are calibrated by emotional significance. The more someone matters to you, the more their behavior has the potential to activate your deepest threat responses. This produces the agonizing experience of being most dysregulated in precisely the relationships where you most want to show up well. The avoider's relationship pattern is characterized by a particular kind of pleasant distance. Avoiders are often widely liked. They don't cause friction, they don't make demands, they're easy to be around in the way that people who require very little from others are easy. But people close to them often feel, over time, that there's a wall they can't quite get past. The intimacy available has a ceiling that becomes apparent just as things were getting real. The avoider's partner or close friend may push for more depth, more vulnerability, more genuine conflict and repair, and find themselves met with pleasant deflection, subject changes, or, when pressure increases, a withdrawal that is harder to read than simple anger and therefore harder to address. Avoiders often carry a deep and painful loneliness alongside their successful maintenance of distance. They want closeness, often intensely, and simultaneously they fear it and move away from it automatically. This internal contradiction is one of the defining features of the avoidant pattern, wanting what you prevent yourself from having, and sometimes not even being aware you're doing the preventing. The self-saboteur's relationship pattern appears most dramatically in the period when things are going well. After a particularly meaningful conversation, a breakthrough of genuine intimacy, a moment of real connection that both people feel, something happens. The self-saboteur picks a fight that didn't need to happen, says the thing they knew would land badly, becomes suddenly cold or distant without being able to explain why. From the outside, this looks like deliberate destruction. From the inside, it feels like a kind of compulsion, a desperate, bewildering need to return to familiar ground from unfamiliar heights. The projection dynamic, one of the most important and most uncomfortable dimensions of how internal patterns affect relationships, is the projection dynamic, the way your own unresolved internal material gets mapped onto the people around you. Projection, in the psychological sense, is not primarily a deliberate act. It is the routine operation of the brain's pattern completion system. Your internal narrative shapes how you interpret the behavior of people around you, and because the neural pathways associated with that narrative are so strong and so efficient, they generate interpretations that feel like clear perception rather than filtered interpretation. When you have a strong internal narrative about yourself, I am fundamentally inadequate, I will eventually be abandoned, I am not safe unless I am in control, people always leave, that narrative shapes how you read the behavior of the specific people in your life. The interpretation is automatic. It happens faster than conscious awareness. And because the neural pathways are so well established, the interpretation arrives with the force of certainty. It doesn't feel like you're interpreting what someone said, it feels like you saw what they meant. The partner who is absent-minded about remembering a commitment gets interpreted, through a lens of abandonment narrative, as not caring. The colleague who disagrees with your approach gets interpreted, through a lens of inadequacy narrative, as attacking your fundamental competence. The friend who cancels plans gets interpreted, through a lens of unworthiness, as evidence that the friendship was never real. The interpretations are not random, they are perfectly consistent with the underlying narrative, which is exactly why they're so convincing. The narrative finds its evidence in the world because it is looking for that specific evidence, in every interaction, and it finds it everywhere. This is not to say that your interpretations are always wrong. Sometimes the partner genuinely doesn't care. Sometimes the colleague is attacking. Sometimes the friendship is superficial. The problem is that the narrative makes you incapable of accurately distinguishing between situations that confirm the narrative and situations that don't. Every event gets routed through the same filter, producing the same conclusion, reinforcing the same story, strengthening the same neural pathway. The relationship becomes less a genuine encounter between two people and more a stage on which your own internal narrative performs. Genuine rewiring, not just the management of surface symptoms but the structural change in the underlying pathways, is the only intervention that genuinely changes this dynamic. Attachment styles as wired patterns. The adult attachment research that followed from Bowlby's foundational work produced one of the most practically useful bodies of knowledge in psychology. The key finding is this: attachment patterns, while deeply embedded, are not fixed. They change through experience, specifically, through sustained experience of a different kind of relationship. Anxious attachment, characterized by a chronic need for reassurance, hypervigilance to signs of withdrawal or rejection in the partner, and a tendency for anxiety to escalate when the other person is unavailable or inconsistent, is not an immutable personality trait. It is a nervous system calibrated by early experience of relational unpredictability. That calibration can shift, gradually and imperfectly, through sustained experience of a relationship in which the other person's responsiveness is reliable. The nervous system learns, through accumulated evidence rather than rational argument, that the feared abandonment is not actually coming. The hypervigilance, still present, begins to be informed by a growing body of counter-evidence. Avoidant attachment, characterized by discomfort with emotional closeness, a strong preference for self-reliance, and a tendency to withdraw when relationships become emotionally intense is a nervous system calibrated by early experience of unresponsiveness or emotional overwhelm. The wired response to emotional intensity is distance, because distance is what produced safety in the original context. That response can change when the person has sustained experience of emotional intensity that does not produce the feared outcome, a relationship in which leaning in doesn't lead to rejection, in which vulnerability doesn't produce dismissal or overwhelm. Research by Glenn Roisman, Mary Dozier, and others has documented how adults can move from insecure to secure attachment through therapeutic relationships, through long-term partnerships with securely attached partners, and through deliberate self-examination work. The change is real but slow. Attachment patterns represent some of the most deeply embedded neural architecture in the human system. But the direction is clear, and the mechanism is the same as all neuroplasticity: new experience, repeatedly encountering a different outcome than the old pattern anticipated, until the new outcome becomes the nervous system's new expectation. When rewiring changes, the dynamic here is something that doesn't get discussed often enough in books about self-improvement. When one person in a relationship begins to genuinely rewire their patterns, the relationship dynamic changes, and not always in ways that are immediately comfortable for either person. The reactor who develops a genuine pause begins to respond differently in situations that used to produce explosive conflict. This is, obviously, the goal. But their partner, who has spent years learning to navigate the reactive cycle, who has calibrated their own behavior around the predictable explosion and the equally predictable reconciliation, may find the new dynamic disorienting. What used to be a clear, if painful, script is now ambiguous. The partner may escalate their own behavior, unconsciously, trying to produce the familiar reactive response that at least is known. This is not malice. It is the nervous system attempting to return to familiar territory. The avoider who begins to engage more fully, to tolerate emotional intensity, to stay present in difficult conversations, finds that their relationships begin to shift in sometimes unexpected ways. Sometimes this creates genuine deepening and relief, as people who had felt the wall for years find it slowly coming down. Sometimes it creates friction, as new vulnerability reveals mismatches in the relationship that the pleasant distance had been obscuring. Two people who have built a relationship on mutual emotional shallowness may find that one person's growing depth creates an asymmetry that requires both people to reckon with what the relationship actually was and what it might become. The ruminator whose loops shorten finds that they have new capacity for presence, and that the people in their lives respond to that presence differently. Conversations that used to feel like performing for an audience that was partially absent start to feel genuinely mutual. This can be disorienting for both parties. The ruminator, discovering what full presence feels like, the people around them, discovering the difference between the half-present person they knew and the person who was actually here. What changes in relationships when the rewiring takes hold is not usually dramatic or sudden. It is the accumulation of many small moments that went differently than they used to: the conversation that didn't escalate, the reassurance that wasn't sought, the vulnerability that was offered, the self-sabotage that didn't execute. Over time, these moments add up to a different kind of relationship. Practical reflection: choose one significant relationship in your life, a partner, a parent, a close friend, a sibling, where you consistently notice one of your primary patterns playing out most clearly and most repeatedly. Describe the pattern specifically, from your side only. Not the other person's behavior, your automatic response to them. What are the specific triggers in this relationship? What is your automatic response when those triggers fire? What does the response feel like from the inside? Does it feel justified? Does it feel like self-protection? Does it feel like truth? What happens after the response, to the interaction and to you? Now consider, what story is your pattern telling about this person or this relationship? What is the core belief underneath the automatic response? This is often one of the most revealing moments of this work, the specific story your nervous system is running about a specific person, which is almost certainly older than this relationship. It began somewhere else, with someone else, and it has been mapped onto this person because they share enough surface features with the original template to activate the old pattern. Think about a moment in this relationship where your pattern caused a result you genuinely didn't want. Not to generate guilt, to generate specificity. Because the rewiring work in Part 3 is most powerful when it's aimed at something concrete, a specific relationship, a specific recurring dynamic, a specific moment where you want to respond differently than you have been. Finally, if your pattern were to genuinely change, if you rewired the default that most consistently shows up in this relationship, what would be different? Not optimistically or vaguely, but specifically. What would the conversation look like that currently escalates? What would you do in the moment you currently withdraw? What would you not undermine? What would you be willing to let be good? Hold that specificity. It is the target. Chapter 7, Level 1, the 7-day pattern interrupt. There is a particular form of paralysis that comes from knowing too much about what needs to change. You've read the chapters. You've identified your pattern. You understand the neuroscience, the default mode network, the basal ganglia, the amygdala's hair trigger, the way cortisol compounds the loop. You can describe your pattern with precision and nuance. And somehow, perhaps because the stakes feel high, or the pattern feels overwhelming, or you've tried before and it didn't work, you haven't yet done anything different. The knowledge sits in your head, organized, incoherent, and completely inert. This protocol exists to break that paralysis. The 7-day pattern interrupt is not a transformation. It does not rewire your deepest neural pathways, does not permanently alter your amygdala's sensitivity, does not rebuild the architecture of your emotional default. It is designed to do one thing: prove to you, through your own direct experience, that your patterns are not as fixed as they feel. 7 days of structured, achievable practice that creates a perceptible gap between your trigger and your response, and uses that gap as the foundation for everything that follows. This protocol requires no prior experience with meditation, therapy, or self-help practices. It requires no special equipment, no dedicated environment, no unusual amount of time. It requires only the willingness to pay attention to what your brain is already doing, and to occasionally do something slightly different. The bar is deliberately low. Low bars, consistently cleared, build the neural foundation for higher ones. Who this protocol is for? This protocol is designed for anyone who wants to verify, through direct experience, that change is possible. You might be completely new to this kind of work, someone who has read Part 1 and Part 2 with recognition and arrived here uncertain where to begin. You might be someone who has tried other approaches and found them either inaccessible, unrealistic in their demands, or productive of short-term improvement that faded quickly. You might be someone who is intellectually convinced by the neuroscience but needs to feel the first shift before committing to deeper work. All of these are valid starting points, and this protocol was built for all of them. The 7-day pattern interrupt is also the right starting point if you're not yet certain which pattern is your primary one. The experience of the week will make it considerably clearer, because you'll be watching for your patterns in real time rather than remembering them retrospectively. And it's the right starting point if you've attempted deeper changes before and found yourself overwhelmed or quickly discouraged. The 7-day scope is intentional, small enough to be fully manageable given any life, long enough to produce a genuine experience of something different. One clarification: if you've already done significant work on your patterns, through therapy, sustained mindfulness practice, or previous serious engagement with this kind of self-examination, and you're looking for deeper structural change, you can assess whether to move directly to Level 2 or Level 3. But if there is any uncertainty about your ability to sustain a practice, if previous attempts at self-change have stalled or reversed quickly, begin here. Establishing the foundational habit of observation is more important than jumping to deeper protocols before you're ready. The 5 core daily rules. These 5 rules are the entire structure of the week. They are deliberately minimal, not because the change you're trying to make is small, but because the goal of this week is to build the habit of noticing, not to attempt the entire rewiring at once. 5 rules, 7 days. That is the complete protocol. The first rule is to name your dominant pattern each morning, in one sentence only. Not a paragraph of analysis, one sentence. My pattern today that I'm watching for is catastrophizing about things I can't control. The pattern I'm watching for today is the urge to withdraw when things get uncomfortable. My pattern is replaying yesterday's difficult conversation instead of being present today. Write it down, say it aloud, or simply hold it clearly in mind before you begin the day. The act of naming, at the start of the day, primes the observing part of your brain to recognize the pattern when it appears. This is not metaphorical. Naming activates the prefrontal cortex's labeling function, which has been shown to reduce amygdala reactivity to emotional stimuli. Putting a word to the pattern is itself a mild form of regulation. The second rule is to catch one automatic thought or reaction per day and not act on it. Just notice it. The thought or reaction will happen probably multiple times. Your only task today is to catch one instance in real time. Not in retrospect, not in the evening log, but in or close to the moment when it's occurring. Register, that's the pattern. That's the thing I was watching for. This moment of meta-awareness, of observing your own automatic process rather than being entirely inside it, is already neurologically significant. The observing brain activates different circuits from the reacting brain. Each catch is a small but real repetition of the new pathway. The third rule is to practice 3 intentional pauses each day. At 3 separate moments, ideally spread across the morning, afternoon, and evening, stop what you're doing, take a single slow breath, and observe your thoughts for 60 seconds. Not evaluate them, not analyze them, not try to change them. Just observe. What is your mind doing right now? What is the quality of your current mental state? Is the pattern present? What else is there? 60 seconds of pure observation. This practice is building the fundamental skill on which all other rewiring depends, the ability to step back from your own mental activity and observe it from a slight remove rather than being entirely inside it. The fourth rule is to use one physical pattern interrupt per day. When you notice the loop starting, the reactive surge beginning to build, or the avoidance pull activating, do something physically different. Cold water on the face or wrists for 60 seconds. 5 minutes of brisk movement. A deliberate change of physical location, leaving the room, going outside for 2 minutes. The body-brain connection is bidirectional. Changing your physical state rapidly changes your neural state. This is not a long-term rewiring tool, it is a first response tool that creates the pause from which more deliberate response becomes possible. It works by activating the body's orienting response, which competes with the pattern's momentum and provides an interruption in the cycle. The fifth rule is the evening log. At the end of each day, before sleep if possible, when the day's experiences are most accessible, spend 5 minutes writing. The log has 2 simple entries: what pattern showed up today, and what did you do differently, even slightly. The second entry doesn't need to be heroic. I noticed the thought loop starting and I went for a 3-minute walk instead of staying in it for an hour is exactly right. I caught myself withdrawing from a conversation and I chose to stay for 2 more minutes before I left is exactly right. I didn't do anything differently, but I noticed the pattern 4 times today when I normally wouldn't have caught it at all is valid and significant progress. Awareness documented is awareness strengthened. The act of writing about what you observed consolidates the observational practice. Day by day guide day focused expected feeling. Key Rule 1 naming the pattern and awareness, mild discomfort. Rule 1-2 first catch surprised how often it shows up. Rule 2-3 the pause practice awkward, mechanical. Rule 3 for a physical interrupt slightly absurd but effective. Rule 4-5 noticing the gap moments of actual choice. Rules 2+3-6 pattern becomes visible less automatic, more observed. Rule 5-7 completion quieter, more observant. All a day 1 is about establishing the container. Name the pattern in the morning, practice the 3 pauses, and write the evening log. Don't try to change anything yet. Notice, document, repeat. Most people experience a mild but real discomfort on this first day, the discomfort of seeing clearly something you've been experiencing without quite seeing. This discomfort is useful information. It confirms that the pattern is real and that bringing it into visibility has some emotional charge. Day 2 introduces the catch. You're looking for one moment today when the pattern shows up and you recognize it in real time. Not in retrospect, in the moment, or within a minute of the moment. This will happen. The pattern shows up constantly, you simply haven't been watching for it with this quality of attention. When the catch happens, you may be startled by how automatic and complete the pattern is, how little warning it gives, how swiftly it moves from trigger to full execution. That recognition is precisely what you're building. Day 3 can feel mechanical and slightly absurd. The 3 intentional pauses take you out of whatever you're doing, and 60 seconds of pure observation can feel like an endless time when you're not practiced at it. The mind will wander, will try to solve problems, will try to evaluate whether you're doing it correctly. Let it be mechanical. Let it be imperfect. The goal is not a profound meditative experience. The goal is the habit of stopping and looking. Day 4 introduces the physical interrupt, and for most people, the first time they use it feels disproportionate to the situation. Standing up from your desk and walking briskly to the kitchen because a thought loop is starting can feel like overreacting. That slightly absurd quality is actually useful. It creates enough disruption in the pattern's momentum to produce a genuine interruption. Use it even when it feels silly. Day 5 is often the most interesting day of the week. The combination of the catch practice, the pauses, and the physical interrupt begins to create a small but perceptible gap in some pattern instances. Not every time. Maybe once during the day. But once is meaningful. One moment when you noticed the loop starting and you had a second of actual choice before the pattern took over, that is the gap. Not the absence of the pattern. The gap before the pattern completes. That gap is what this week is building. Day 6 often brings a qualitative shift in visibility. The pattern that felt like atmosphere, omnipresent and invisible, just the texture of your inner life, starts to feel more like weather, something you can see moving in. Not fully in your control, but observable. Observability is the precondition for change. You cannot deliberately respond to something you cannot see. Day 7 is completion. The goal today is not heroics. It's to complete the day with all 5 rules, write the final evening log, and honestly assess where you are relative to where you were 7 days ago. The assessment should be specific. How long did the loops run on day 1 versus day 7? How many catches did you make on day 2 versus day 6? Not to generate a performance review, to see the actual trajectory. Slip protocol. A slip is any day when you go entirely on autopilot, when the morning naming doesn't happen, the pauses don't happen, the physical interrupt doesn't happen, and you arrive at bedtime having done nothing from the protocol. Life is complex. Slips happen. If this happens, here is your complete response. Write 1 sentence. The pattern today was. That's it. That's enough for the day. 1 sentence of honest recognition, written before sleep, keeps the observing brain active and maintains the thread of the practice even through a lost day. Tomorrow, return to all 5 rules. Do not use the slip as evidence that you can't do this. The brain's negativity bias will. Take a single difficult day and try to construct a narrative about inherent inability. 1 slip in 7 days is not evidence of inability. It is evidence that you had a hard day. The most important thing you can do after a slip is refuse to write the story about it and simply return to the practice. The greatest risk in this kind of protocol is not the days you slip, it's the story you tell about the slip. Watch that story carefully. It is the pattern trying to use your self-improvement attempt against you. Daily tracking table. Use this table each day. Brevity is fine, 2 or 3 words per cell are enough. The goal is the habit of documentation, not literary quality. Date, pattern noticed, pause used. What you did differently. Notes. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. What to expect. The first 2 days of this protocol will likely make you more uncomfortable, not less. Bringing sustained attention to your patterns without yet having robust tools to change them significantly is unsettling. You may find yourself noticing the pattern more frequently than you realized it was occurring, which can feel alarming, like you're getting worse, like the work is making things more intense rather than quieter. You are not getting worse. You are getting more accurate. There is a real and important difference. The discomfort of accurate observation is the discomfort of being present to something you've been slightly away from. It is the moment in a relationship when you stop telling yourself it's fine and admit that something is actually hard. The admission is uncomfortable. It is also the beginning of the possibility of change, in a way that the comfortable avoidance of accurate perception was not. By days 4 and 5, most people who stay with the protocol experience something specific, a moment where the automatic response that would normally have fired completely, the thought loop that would have run for 2 hours, the reactive comment that would have been said, the pull to withdraw that would have been followed without question, is instead partially interrupted. Not stopped. Interrupted. There's a half second of recognition, and in that half second, something slightly different happens. That is the gap. The gap is small. In these early days, it may last less than a second. You may not always be able to do anything with it. But it is there. It exists. And it didn't exist before you started this practice. That is the structural change, in its earliest form. By day 7, the most common reports from people who complete this protocol describe a quality of greater observational distance from their own automatic processes. The pattern is still there. But the experience of it has changed. Instead of being inside the pattern looking out, you're beginning to be outside the pattern, watching it operate. That shift, from immersion to observation, is the foundational experience of rewiring. Everything in Level 2 and Level 3 builds on it. The 7-day protocol doesn't complete the rewiring. It begins it. More importantly, it demonstrates that the beginning is possible, that your patterns, however long established, however deeply familiar, are visible and interruptible. That is the thing you needed to know. And now you know it from experience, not just from reading. That is a different kind of knowledge. It is the kind that can be built on. Chapter 8, Level 2, the 21-day rewiring system. In the 1960s, Maxwell Maltz, a plastic surgeon, noticed something consistent in his patients. It took approximately 21 days after a procedure for patients to stop feeling phantom sensations in the altered area, to adjust psychologically to their changed appearance, and to begin building new mental images of themselves. He mentioned this observation in his 1960 book Psychocybernetics, and the 21-day figure took on a life of its own, eventually becoming one of the most frequently cited, and frequently misunderstood, claims in self-help history. It takes 21 days to form a habit became a cultural axiom. Maltz never said it took 21 days to form a habit. He said it took at least 21 days, and that was under optimal conditions for a specific kind of psychological adjustment. The actual research on habit formation, most notably the 2010 study by Philippa Lally and her colleagues at University College London, which tracked 96 people as they tried to establish new habits, found that the time to reach automaticity varied widely, from 18 days to 254 days, depending on the complexity of the behavior, the individual, and the consistency of practice. The reason this matters is that 21 days will not complete your rewiring. It will not make your new response fully automatic or eliminate the pull of the old pathway. What 21 days of consistent practice will do, what this protocol is actually designed to accomplish, is begin the structural change in your neural pathways that makes the new response genuinely competitive with the old one. Not dominant. Competitive. You'll feel the difference. You'll also feel how much further the work has to go. That honest framing is the context for everything that follows. If you come to this protocol expecting to emerge transformed, you will be disappointed. If you come expecting to emerge with a new pathway that now competes meaningfully with the old one, in real situations, under real pressure, you will find exactly what was promised. Who this protocol is for people who have completed the 7-day pattern interrupt, or who have been doing consistent self-observation work through other means, and are ready to move beyond noticing and begin actively installing new patterns. The Level 2 protocol is appropriate if you have a clearly identified primary pattern, have experienced the gap between trigger and response at least occasionally, and are prepared to engage with the more demanding practice of responding differently in real situations with real people in real time. That last part is critical. Level 1 was primarily internal observation, logging, physical interrupts. Level 2 takes the work into the world. It requires you to plan new responses, practice them mentally, attempt them under real conditions, and analyze honestly what happens when they fail. If you have done significant previous work on your patterns, therapy, sustained mindfulness practice, serious engagement with CBT or similar frameworks, Level 2 is likely the right starting point for the protocol work in this book. The structure will be familiar in its approach, but the specific combination of visualization, real-time redirect, failure debriefing, and accountability is calibrated for the particular kind of neural change this book is targeting. The 6 core daily rules. The first rule is the morning intention. Each morning, before the day's demands arrive, write one specific intention using this structure. Today I respond to X with Y instead of Z. The specificity is not optional, it is the entire mechanism. Not today I'm going to be more patient, that's a diffuse aspiration with no neural target. But, today when my partner starts to raise their voice, I'm going to take a slow breath and say, I need a moment to think, instead of matching their volume and escalating. Today when I feel the thought loop starting about the meeting that went badly, I'm going to write 2 sentences about what I'm feeling and then redirect to the task in front of me instead of running the loop for an hour. specific trigger, specific new response, specific old response being replaced. The brain needs this specificity to activate the relevant neural circuitry. The second rule is visualization practice, 5 minutes each morning of mentally rehearsing the new response before you encounter the trigger. Sit somewhere reasonably quiet, close your eyes, and run the scenario in as much sensory detail as you can generate. See the situation, the physical environment, the people involved. Feel the trigger activating, the specific sensation in your body that precedes the old pattern. Notice the pull of the old response, feel its momentum. And then, in the visualization, see yourself doing something different. Feel the pause. Hear yourself saying the new words. Experience the outcome. End the scene. Repeat it 2 or 3 times within the 5 minutes. This is not wishful thinking. This is neural rehearsal. You are literally rehearsing the new pathway before the situation requires it, using the same mechanism that makes mental rehearsal effective for athletes, musicians, and surgical trainees. The third rule is real-time redirect. When the old pattern appears in the actual situations of your day, execute the pre-planned new response. This sounds straightforward. It is not. When the trigger fires in a real situation with real emotional stakes, the planned new response will feel foreign, effortful, slightly awkward, and possibly completely inadequate compared to the automatic response that the old pathway is simultaneously generating. The old pathway is smooth and fast, the new one is rough and slow. Do it anyway. Even imperfectly. Even with obvious awkwardness. Even when the old pathway fires simultaneously and the new response happens alongside it rather than cleanly replacing it. Each imperfect execution of the new response is a repetition that strengthens the new pathway. Each conscious attempt, however messy, contributes to the structural change. The fourth rule is failure debriefing. When the old pattern wins, when the loop runs its full course, when the reactive response fires, when the avoidance executes completely, when the self-sabotage happens, spend 3 minutes analyzing it. Not shaming. Analyzing. What was the exact trigger in this specific instance? What made this triggering situation harder than the ones you visualized? What was the thought or feeling that preceded the automatic response, what came immediately before the pattern launched? What would the next 50 milliseconds of the new pathway have looked like if you'd caught it 1 moment earlier? This analysis is building the detailed neural self-knowledge that enables earlier and earlier intervention. You're learning the specific topology of your resistance. The fifth rule is accountability. Share 1 pattern win per day with someone. This can be a friend who knows what you're working on, a partner, a therapist, a coach, or an online accountability group. It doesn't need to be extensive. A brief text message saying caught the loop and went for a walk instead of following it for an hour is exactly right. The accountability serves 2 neurological purposes. It strengthens the new pathway through verbal articulation. Putting the new behavior into language activates different neural pathways than the behavioral experience alone, creating a more elaborate neural representation of the new response. And it engages the brain's social reward circuitry, producing a mild positive reinforcement signal that makes the new behavior slightly more motivationally compelling than purely private practice does. The sixth rule is the evening reflection. 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each day, writing answers to 2 specific questions. What fired differently today? Where did the new pathway activate, even partially, even briefly, even imperfectly? And what wired together? What did you practice? Enough times today that it might be slightly more established tomorrow than it was yesterday? The language is deliberately neurological. What fired differently is a factual question about events in the day, not a grade of your performance. What wired together points toward the future, what is being built, in increments, through the day's repetitions. This framing keeps the evening reflection from becoming either self-congratulation or self-criticism and makes it useful as an actual training log. The 3-week structure. The 3 weeks are not interchangeable in their demands or their characteristic experience. Understanding what each week is designed to accomplish helps you interpret what you're experiencing and calibrate your effort accordingly. Week 1 is foundation. During this week, set the intention for 1 specific pattern to rewire, just 1. The temptation to work on multiple patterns simultaneously is real, particularly for people who identified strong scores on multiple dimensions of the Chapter 3 audit. Resist it. Diffusing the work across multiple patterns reduces the repetition per pathway, which reduces the structural change per pathway. One targeted pattern, 21 days. During week 1, do the visualization practice and the morning intention every day, but don't force the real-time redirect. If the trigger fires and you use the new response naturally, excellent. The primary goal of week 1 is to make the visualization feel real, to build a mental rehearsal that has enough sensory detail and emotional texture to produce genuine neural activation. Expect the visualization to feel somewhat artificial early in the week. Keep going. Week 2 is deepening. This is the hardest week. You're now actively attempting to execute the new response in real situations, and the collision between the intended new response and the automatic old one is most acute. You will slip back into the old pattern multiple times, frequently in the early days of week 2. This is not failure. This is the experience of running two competing programs simultaneously. The old pathway is still faster, more efficient, and more strongly reinforced. The new one is newer and slower, and it's competing against something that has years or decades of repetition behind it. The failure debriefing practice is critical this week. The analysis of each instance where the old pattern 1 is building the neural map of your specific trigger landscape, the precise conditions, emotions, and situations under which the old pathway is most powerful. Week 3 is integration. By week 3, most people report something specific and qualitatively new. The new response fires in at least some contexts without the full force of conscious effort. Not all contexts, not the most difficult, most emotionally charged triggering situations. But in situations with moderate emotional stakes, the new pathway is beginning to compete with real effectiveness. There are moments when the new response fires and it feels less effortful than it did 2 weeks ago, more natural, more accessible. The old pathway is still there, still accessible, and will still dominate in high-stress moments. But the new one is louder than it was. These moments of easier access are the evidence of genuine structural change. Weekly Thought Record Template. Use one of these tables for each week. Complete it daily. Did it work? Is not binary right partially, no, but I noticed, yes, imperfectly, yes, cleanly in this one instance, whatever is accurate. Day a trigger or old response, a new response attempted. Did it work? What I learned a 1, 2, 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, 7. The table is not a report card. It is a training log. Its purpose is to build a detailed picture of the specific landscape of your pattern, which triggers are most powerful, which new responses feel most natural, which contexts are hardest. Over 3 weeks of daily entries, patterns within the pattern become visible. You may notice that the old pathway is strongest at particular times of day, or under particular physical conditions, tired, hungry, under pressure, or in interactions with specific people. Each of these observations is actionable information for the adjustment column of the weekly check-in. Navigating work and social pressure. The challenge of level 2 is that the highest stakes triggering situations, the ones where the old pattern is most deeply embedded and most likely to dominate, often occur in exactly the contexts where experimenting with a new response feels most risky: important professional relationships, close family dynamics, high-stakes conversations about difficult topics. It helps to distinguish between practice contexts and high-stakes contexts, and to be strategic about where you attempt the new response in the early weeks. Low-stakes situations, interactions with people you're comfortable with, situations where the consequences of an imperfect new response are minimal, conversations that matter but not acutely, are the best early practice ground. They offer the trigger at reduced intensity, which gives the new pathway a chance to fire without having to compete against the old pathway at maximum activation. By week 3, if the practice has been consistent, you'll have enough experience with the new pathway in lower stakes situations that you can begin deliberately engaging with the higher stakes ones. Not creating confrontations for the sake of practice, but not avoiding your most difficult triggers either. The goal is to give the new pathway experience in progressively more demanding conditions to help it generalize from the contexts in which you've trained it to the full range of situations where the old pattern used to dominate. For workplace triggers specifically, the adaptation is primarily internal rather than behavioral. The morning intention is set privately. The visualization happens before work. The failure debrief happens after hours. What changes externally is your behavior, slightly, then more noticeably, over the course of 3 weeks. You don't need to explain what you're doing. You don't need to announce a project. The changes will show in the quality of your responses, and they don't require any label. Weekly check-in table. Complete this at the end of each week. The adjustment column for each week should directly inform how you approach the next week. Pattern wins, pattern losses. Key insight. Adjustment for next week. 1, 2, 3. If week 1 reveals that your visualization lacks emotional texture, that you're rehearsing the new response in abstract rather than sensory terms, the adjustment for week 2 is to add physical sensation, specific dialogue, and emotional color to the mental rehearsal. If week 2 reveals that the new response collapses specifically under time pressure or when multiple triggers fire simultaneously, the adjustment for week 3 is to specifically rehearse those compound trigger scenarios in the visualization. The protocol adapts to what you learn about your specific pattern landscape. The framework is the same for everyone. The calibration is entirely yours. What to expect. Week 1, the visualization will feel somewhat fictional. You'll wonder if you're doing it right, if it's doing anything, if the gap between the imagined scenario and the real triggering situation is too wide for the practice to matter. The research is clear that mental rehearsal produces real neural change, but that conviction is hard to feel in the early stages when the practice still feels artificial. Keep going. The artificiality is the early stage, not evidence of failure. The brain needs time to accept the rehearsal as genuine practice rather than fiction. Week 2 is the crucible. 2 competing programs running simultaneously. In real situations with real consequences, the old pattern will win frequently. Some days, the new response won't even get close to firing. The old pathway will be so dominant in that particular situation that there's no competition at all. The failure debrief on those days is the most important practice of the week. The question to sit with is not why couldn't I do this, but what specifically made this instance so difficult, and what would I need to catch it earlier? That question is building the map. Week 3, the shift is usually perceptible but modest. Not dramatic. Not complete. The new response fires reliably in lower stakes situations and sometimes in medium stakes ones. The old pattern still dominates in high stress contexts. What you will notice if the practice has been consistent is that the old pattern has lost some of its previous automaticity. There is a moment, not always long enough to act in, but perceptible, before the old response fires. The old pathway is getting slightly slower. The new one is getting slightly faster. They're not equal yet. But the competition is real, and it is growing. 21 days of this protocol creates genuine structural neural change, not transformation, but real architectural progress. The most important thing to carry out of the 21 days is the practice, the daily intention, the visualization, the failure debrief, the evening reflection. The protocol gives these practices structure and duration. You take them forward. Chapter 9, Level 3, the 30-Day Neural Architecture Rebuild. In the summer of 2011, a team of researchers led by Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School published a study in the journal Psychiatry Research, Neuroimaging that generated significant attention. They had taken a group of people with no meditation experience and put them through an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program, 45 minutes of daily practice. They scanned participants' brains before and after the program. What they found was not subtle, measurable increases in cortical thickness in regions associated with attention, interoception, and sensory processing. And measurable decreases in amygdala volume, corresponding with self-reported reductions in stress. 8 weeks. 45 minutes a day. Measurable structural brain change. This is not an exceptional finding in isolation. It is one of dozens of studies across the last 2 decades documenting that sustained daily practice, meditation, exercise, cognitive training, or combinations thereof, produces quantifiable changes in brain structure and function. The brain physically reorganizes in response to what you repeatedly do with it. This is the science that Level 3 is built on. The 30-Day Neural Architecture Rebuild is the most demanding protocol in this book. It is designed for patterns that are deeply rooted, patterns tied to chronic stress, significant adversity, decades of reinforcement, or early experience that shape the basic architecture of your emotional responses. It requires a genuine daily commitment. It requires honesty about what you're actually doing versus what you intend to do. And it requires patience with a process that will feel significantly worse before it feels better. Before beginning, if you are dealing with clinical depression, PTSD, an anxiety disorder, or any other diagnosed mental health condition, this protocol is not a replacement for professional treatment. It can be a powerful complement to professional support. But the work of rewiring deeply rooted trauma-related patterns is serious work, and attempting it without adequate support is both harder and potentially re-traumatizing. If that description fits you, build the professional support before or alongside this protocol, not after. Who this protocol is for? This protocol is for people whose patterns have outlasted previous attempts to change them, who have tried level 1 or level 2 style approaches and found that the patterns reassert themselves, often with striking resilience, after a period of improvement. It is for people whose primary pattern is tied to something fundamental, an early experience of chronic unpredictability or danger, a sustained period of traumatic stress, or a lifetime of reinforcing a core belief that has now shaped their perception of almost everything. It is also for people who are ready to commit to a practice that goes beyond managing their pattern in daily life and reaches for something more, a genuine restructuring of the default operating system, not just new responses in specific triggering situations, but a different baseline. A different resting state of the nervous system. A different quality of presence in ordinary life. This is a high bar. It requires 30 days of consistent daily practice across 8 specific areas. You will not do all 8 perfectly every day. The protocol accounts for that. But you need to do enough of them, consistently enough, for the cumulative structural effect to occur. The 8 core daily practices. The first practice is morning pages, 3 pages of stream of consciousness writing, done by hand, immediately after waking. The concept comes from Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, but the application here is not creative recovery, it is neural excavation. 3 pages of whatever is in your head, without editing, without judgment, without concern for coherence. The only rules are to keep the pen moving and to not censor. This practice accomplishes several things simultaneously. It externalizes the default mode. Networks morning output, the ruminative loops, the worries, the self-commentary, moving them from internal cycling to external page. It activates the observing mind before the reactive mind is fully operational. And it creates a daily record of your internal landscape that, over 30 days, becomes an extraordinary map of your pattern-specific territory. The second practice is mindfulness meditation, 20 minutes daily, using a simple breath-focused or body scan technique. The purpose here is not relaxation, it is observation of the machinery of thought. During the meditation, you will notice thoughts arising, persisting, and passing. You will notice the pull of the default mode network, the way attention is captured and pulled into the loop, and the possibility of returning attention to the breath without self-judgment. Each cycle of noticing the loop, not following it, and returning attention is a repetition of the exact neural sequence you're trying to build: observation, non-engagement, redirection. 20 minutes of this daily produces the kind of measurable structural change documented in the Lazar study and dozens of others. The third practice is visualization, 10 minutes of mentally rehearsing 3 key new response patterns each morning. Unlike Level 2, which focuses on one specific trigger response pair, Level 3's visualization practice covers 3, reflecting the broader scope of the architecture you're rebuilding. For each, run the full sensory rehearsal: the trigger, the pull of the old response, the pause, the execution of the new response, the felt experience of a different outcome. 3 cycles per morning, across 30 days, builds a mental library of new patterns that the brain gradually begins to draw on in real situations. The fourth practice is physical training, 30 minutes of movement every day. This is not optional and it is not negotiable, because exercise is the single most evidence-backed tool for neuroplasticity available without a prescription. John Ratey, the Harvard psychiatrist who wrote Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise and the Brain, documents how aerobic exercise increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein sometimes called miracle grow for the brain because of its role in promoting the growth of new neurons and the strengthening of existing connections. Exercise also directly reduces amygdala reactivity, suppresses the cortisol cycle that maintains chronic stress states, and improves both the quantity and quality of sleep, which is itself a major determinant of neuroplasticity. Walk briskly. Run. Swim. Cycle. Do yoga. The specific form is less important than the daily consistency. The fifth practice is sleep protocol, consistent bedtime and wake time every day of the 30, including weekends. During deep sleep, the brain consolidates the learning from the day, it strengthens the new patterns that were practiced, prunes the old ones that were not activated, and processes the emotional material of the day in ways that reduce its charge. Disrupted or insufficient sleep doesn't just make you tired. It actively undermines the consolidation process that your daily practice is designed to generate. The sleep protocol, which should aim for 7 to 9 hours for most adults, is the mechanism by which the day's practice becomes permanent structural change. Without it, you're practicing without allowing the practice to stick. The sixth practice is cognitive reframing. Each week, identify one core belief you're working to update. Write it explicitly: I believe that asking for help is weakness and will expose my incompetence. Then spend time, daily, 5 to 10 minutes, writing evidence for and against this belief. Real evidence, from your actual life. Not attempts to argue yourself out of the belief, but a genuine audit of whether the belief is accurate. Over 4 weeks, 4 core beliefs receive this treatment. This is not cognitive behavioral therapy, it is a structured application of CBT's core technique, adapted for independent practice. The mechanism is the same, gradually exposing the core belief to the full range of evidence about its accuracy, rather than allowing it to filter experience selectively in ways that perpetually confirm it. The seventh practice is accountability, a weekly conversation with a coach, therapist, or trusted partner. This is the one practice that cannot be done alone. Not because the others are ineffective without it, they are, but because the presence of another person who sees you clearly and holds you to honest account dramatically accelerates the rewiring process. The social brain, the neural systems that process relationships, reputation, and interpersonal reality, is deeply implicated in the patterns you're rewiring. Engaging it deliberately, in a supportive accountability structure, adds a dimension that purely internal practice cannot replicate. The eighth practice is digital minimalism, 2-hour phone-free blocks each day, ideally in the morning. The reasoning is neurological. The constant low-grade stimulation of device use, the notifications, the social comparisons, the infinite scroll activates the default mode network in a particular way, keeping it engaged with social evaluation, threat monitoring, and self-comparison. This is the exact mode you're trying to calm and retrain. 2 hours of genuine phone-free time each day gives the brain an extended window of operating at a lower stimulation level, which makes the morning pages, meditation, and visualization practices more effective, and gives the brain time to consolidate the new patterns being built rather than immediately returning to the old ones. The 4-week structure. Week 1 is withdrawal. The first week is about stripping back stimulation and establishing the daily structure of the practices. Expect this week to feel disorienting. When you reduce external stimulation and bring sustained attention to your internal landscape, the default mode network's patterns become highly visible, often more distressing than when they were running beneath your conscious awareness. You may feel more anxious, more prone to the loop, more aware of the emotional charge on things you hadn't been consciously attending to. This is normal. This is what it feels like when the default mode loses some of its cover. The practices are working. Week 2 is fog lifting. The daily practices are beginning to create cumulative structural effects. The morning pages are externalizing the loops. The meditation is building observational distance. The exercise is changing the biochemical environment of the brain. The visualization is strengthening new pathways. Most people in week 2 describe a quality of the default patterns feeling slightly less absolute, still dominant, still frequent, but less final. There are moments when the loop doesn't capture you completely. Moments when the reactive surge is noticed before it fires. The fog hasn't lifted, but there are clear patches. Week 3 is rebuild. New neural pathways are gaining genuine strength. The visualization practice is producing new responses that fire in some real situations without full conscious effort. The cognitive reframing of core beliefs has produced at least one genuine update, one belief that now has a more accurate, less uniformly negative content than it had 3 weeks ago. Physical training has changed your body's baseline cortisol level and your brain's BDNF levels. Sleep consolidation has been working on the new patterns every night. This is the week when most people first experience what the rewiring actually feels like from the inside, a qualitative difference in their own processing that they can observe and name. Week 4 is new architecture. You're different now in specific, observable ways. Not completely transformed, the old patterns still exist, the old pathways are still there, and high-stress situations can still trigger strong regression. But the baseline has shifted. The new patterns are no longer just intentional, some of them are becoming automatic. The work of week 4 is to observe, clearly and precisely, what has changed and what hasn't, and to design the maintenance practices from Chapter 10 around that specific map. Emergency protocol, the stop technique when the old pattern floods back completely, when a high-stress event or situation produces full regression, when every new practice is temporarily inaccessible and the old architecture is running at full capacity, use the stop technique. Stop. Whatever you're doing, physically stop. Sit down if possible. Stand still if not. The act of physical stopping interrupts the momentum of the reactive sequence. Take a breath. One deliberate, slow exhalation. Not because deep breathing is magic, but because a slow exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which directly counters the sympathetic activation of the stress response. You are using your body to talk to your brain. Observe what's happening. Not evaluate, not judge, not try to fix. Simply observe. What is the emotion? What is the thought? Where is it in the body? What triggered this? The observation activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain capable of deliberate response, and inserts at least a brief interval between stimulus and action. Proceed with intention, not reaction. From the observed state, choose a response rather than executing the automatic one. The choice doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the ideal new response from your visualization practice. It just has to be chosen rather than automatic. That choice, however imperfect, however partial, is the rewiring, in its most essential form. Social and work navigation during the 30 days of this protocol will alter your behavior in ways that may be noticeable to the people around you. You will be more present in some interactions and more likely to pause in others. You may become less reactive in ways that disrupt familiar patterns in your relationships. You may have less tolerance for extended periods of reactive conversation or social comparison, and more need for the quiet, unstructured time that the practices require. Some of the people in your life will find the changes welcome and relieving. Others may find them disorienting or may unconsciously push against them, for the reasons discussed in Chapter 6. You don't need to announce the protocol or explain what you're doing. But if the changes become significant enough to require explanation, "I'm working on some things" is entirely adequate. The people who need more than that are the people with whom the conversation about patterns is probably already overdue. During periods of high work pressure, a project deadline, a difficult professional situation, an unusually demanding period, reduce the expectation for the protocol rather than abandoning it. The minimum viable practice is morning pages, 10 minutes of 30 is impossible, 5 minutes of meditation, and the evening reflection. These three, maintained through difficult periods, keep the practice alive and prevent the full regression described in the next chapter. What to expect? This protocol is uncomfortable. The brain resists change even when the change is in the direction of relief, because the old patterns, however painful, are deeply familiar, and the brain's primary bias is toward the familiar. The early weeks of Level 3 often feel like things are getting worse before they get better, because excavating the pattern landscape is disturbing before it's clarifying. Weeks 2 and 3 are where most people who abandon the protocol abandon it, not because it isn't working, but because the working is uncomfortable and the results are not yet dramatic enough to feel worth the discomfort. If you find yourself there, this is the thing to know: the discomfort of weeks 2 and 3 is the friction of two neural architectures competing. The old one is losing ground. The new one is gaining it. The friction is the evidence that the change is real. By week 4, most people who complete the full protocol report something that is harder to describe than the early discomfort but more significant: a qualitative shift in who they feel themselves to be in the situations that used to trap them. Not a new personality, themselves, but with different default responses. The familiar trigger appears, and something different happens inside. The pause is real. The choice is available. The person they intended to be is, in those moments, the person they actually are. That is a 30-day result. It is not permanent without maintenance. But it is real, and it is the foundation for everything Chapter 10 describes. Chapter 10, Sustaining the Rewiring. There is a moment that almost everyone who has done genuine rewiring work eventually encounters. Months have passed. The practices have become habitual. The patterns that used to dominate are now background noise, present, noticeable, but no longer running the show. Life has changed in observable ways, relationships are clearer, decisions are more deliberate, the daily texture of your inner life is quieter. You might even have the thought that you're finished, that you've arrived somewhere. And then something happens. A major stressor. A loss. A period of sustained pressure. The practices start slipping, first the evening reflection, then the morning intention, then the exercise, then the meditation. The old patterns begin showing up with their old authority. The loop runs longer. The reactive response fires faster. You have a conversation that you would have handled very differently 3 months ago, and you handled it the old way. And somewhere in the aftermath, a deeply familiar thought surfaces: maybe nothing actually changed. Maybe I'm just the same person I always was. This is not a relapse. This is neurology. The old neural pathways didn't disappear. They weakened, while new ones strengthened. But under sufficient stress, particularly the kind that activates the amygdala strongly, suppresses the prefrontal cortex, disrupts sleep, and removes the conditions under which the new patterns were practiced, the old pathways can reassert themselves. Not because the rewiring failed. Because the conditions for the old patterns were recreated, and the old pathways ran. Understanding this in advance, understanding that regression is predictable, that it follows specific patterns, and that it has specific recovery protocols, is one of the most important pieces of this chapter. Because the difference between a brief regression and a complete return to baseline is almost entirely determined by what you do in the first 48 hours after the regression begins. The green-yellow-red zone framework. This framework gives you a real-time system for assessing where you are in relation to your own baseline so that you can intervene early, before regression becomes full reactivation. The green zone is your functioning baseline, the state you worked to build during the protocols. In the green zone, the new patterns are firing consistently. Emotional reactivity is at its normal, post-rewiring level. Thought loops are brief, they appear and pass rather than capturing you for extended periods. The daily practices feel sustainable rather than effortful. Your relationships reflect the changes you've made. The observational distance from your patterns is intact. The yellow zone is the early warning state. Old patterns are showing up more frequently than your baseline. Stress is reliably triggering the defaults. You're noticing slippage, the practices are happening less consistently, or with less quality. The thought loops are longer than they've been. Reactive responses are occurring more often. You're less present in relationships. Importantly, you're aware of the slippage. The observing brain is still functioning, still noting the drift. This awareness is the yellow zone's defining feature, and it's the window for early intervention. The red zone is full reactivation. The default mode has reasserted itself as the primary operating system. Old reactions are dominant. The new practices have been largely abandoned, not necessarily through conscious decision, but through accumulated slippage until there's nothing left. Most significantly, the re-identification has begun. You're starting to believe again that the pattern is simply who you are, that the improvement was temporary, exceptional, and fundamentally not you. The story of unchangeability is back. The green-yellow-red framework matters because the intervention required is different at each level. In the yellow zone, the response is maintenance recalibration, returning to the core daily practices. Doing the monthly check-in, identifying the specific stressor or change that triggered the drift and addressing it. The cost of yellow zone intervention is days. In the red zone, the response is essentially a reset back to a version of the level 1 or level 2 protocol, depending on how far the regression has gone. The cost of red zone recovery is weeks. The earlier you catch the drift, the cheaper the recovery. The 4-stage relapse pattern. Almost all neural regression follows a predictable sequence. Recognizing the sequence, being able to name which stage you're in, is itself a form of intervention. The first stage is the stress spike. A significant event or sustained pressure triggers the old coping responses. This is not a relapse yet, this is the stress response doing what the stress response does. A death in the family. A major professional crisis. A relationship breakdown. A health emergency. These events will activate old patterns. The question is, what happens next? The second stage is partial abandonment. The practices begin dropping off, one by one. First, the ones that require the most time or effort. The morning pages become 5 minutes. The meditation becomes occasional. The exercise becomes sporadic. The evening reflection stops entirely. Each drop feels justified by the circumstances. I don't have time right now is both true and the beginning of the undoing. The third stage is full regression. Without the practices that were building and maintaining the new pathways, the old ones gain ground by default. Old patterns begin feeling normal again. The reactive response fires at its pre-rewiring frequency. The loops run at their pre-rewiring length. The avoider is avoiding, the ruminator is ruminating, the reactor is reacting. This stage can feel like waking up to find yourself back at the beginning, which generates its own emotional charge. The fourth stage is re-identification. This is the most dangerous stage, and also the most subtle. The person stops thinking of the old pattern as a pattern and starts thinking of it as themselves again. This is just how I deal with stress. I was fooling myself, I'm not actually a calm person. The improvement wasn't real. When the re-identification completes, the motivation to return to the practices collapses, because the practices are understood as attempts to be someone you're not rather than attempts to maintain who you genuinely became. If you can catch the pattern at stage 1 or 2, the recovery is straightforward and fast. Stage 3 requires a conscious reset. Stage 4 requires, in addition to the reset, a direct confrontation with the re-identification story, a return to the evidence of the change that did happen, and an honest examination of why the brain is now insisting it didn't. The 333 monthly check once a month, calendar it, don't leave it to memory, sit down for 20 minutes with these 3 sets of questions. 3 wins, which new patterns are now firing automatically? These are the patterns that have become genuinely integrated, where the new response fires without requiring conscious effort, in situations that used to trigger the old one reliably. Be specific. I no longer spend more than 20 minutes on the thought loop about the work situation before redirecting is a win. I'm somehow calmer is not specific enough to be useful. 3 gaps, which triggers still reliably produce old responses? Not the rare ones, the consistent ones. The situations where, despite the rewiring work, the old pathway still fires with its old authority. These are the next targets. They're not failures, they're the map for continued work. 3 adjustments. What changes would support the new architecture going forward? This could be adding a practice, removing a drain on the system, a stressor, a relationship dynamic, a scheduled commitment that is eroding the conditions the practices need, or modifying an existing practice that has become routine enough to lose its effectiveness. The 333 takes 20 minutes. It produces a current assessment of the neural architecture you've built, identifies where it needs reinforcement, and generates a specific adjustment plan. Across 12 months, 12 of these check-ins create a longitudinal picture of your rewiring journey that is both practically useful and genuinely illuminating, a record of what has permanently changed, what cycles back, and what remains consistent work. Trigger seasons. Certain periods of life are reliably high risk for neural regression, and knowing them in advance reduces their disruptive power. Grief is the most powerful trigger of regression, because it activates the brain's threat and loss systems at a depth that overwhelms most deliberate regulation strategies. In periods of active grief, the goal is not to maintain the rewiring protocol at full intensity, it's to maintain the minimum viable practice and to add one thing: permission to not be okay, without interpreting not okay as evidence of permanent regression. Illness, particularly extended illness, disrupts sleep, exercise, and the physical conditions that support neuroplasticity, while also creating the chronic low-grade stress that strengthens the old reactive pathways. The minimum viable practice again. Move when you can. Sleep as much as the illness allows. Don't add the guilt of protocol non-compliance to the burden of being sick. Major life changes, moves, new jobs, new relationships, the end of relationships, having children, retirement, all involve the disruption of routine, which is also the disruption of the environmental conditions in which the new patterns were practiced. New environments activate the brain's threat monitoring in ways that can temporarily increase default mode activity. The adjustment period is real. Give it time, and rebuild the practice deliberately in the new context rather than expecting the old routines to survive the transition unchanged. Sleep deprivation is perhaps the most underestimated trigger. Even 2 or 3 nights of poor sleep can measurably increase amygdala reactivity, reduce prefrontal cortex function, and weaken emotional regulation capacity. A sleep-deprived version of you is a neurologically compromised version of you, more reactive, more ruminative, more susceptible to the old pathways. If you're in a period of disrupted sleep, expect regression and don't catastrophize it. Address the sleep. Environmental design. One of the most practical and underutilized tools for sustaining rewiring is the deliberate design of the physical, digital, and social environments in which you live. The physical environment should support the daily practices through consistency of place and time. The same chair for morning pages. The same location for meditation. The same time for exercise. The brain is pattern dependent, it takes contextual cues from the environment as signals for what to do. When you practice in a consistent environment, the environment itself becomes a cue for the practice. The routine becomes embedded not just in your intentions but in the neural associations between the place, the time, and the activity. The digital environment requires active management because it was not designed with your neurological well-being in mind. Social media platforms are specifically engineered to activate the default mode network's social comparison and threat detection circuits to keep you scrolling by delivering intermittent emotional activation. This is not a moral judgment, it's a design fact. Protecting the morning from screens, specifically the window before your practices are complete, preserves the state of neuroplasticity that sleep creates and that screens rapidly disrupt. 2 hours of morning phone-free time is not asceticism. It's biology. The social environment is the most powerful and the most difficult to design. The people you spend significant time with are, at a neural level, influencing your default patterns through a mechanism called emotional contagion, the automatic synchronization of emotional states that occurs in face-to-face interaction. Chronic exposure to highly reactive, ruminative, or avoidant people tends to activate those same patterns in you, through neural mirroring and social learning. This doesn't mean eliminating people from your life. It means being intentional about which relationships receive the most of your limited time and attention, and deliberately cultivating relationships with people whose default patterns you want to mirror. Annual reset once a year, at the anniversary of beginning this work, or at the natural reset of the new year, or at any point when a clear opportunity arises, conduct a focused 7-day pattern interrupt, as described in Chapter 7. The purpose of the annual reset is not to remediate a crisis. It's maintenance. It's the neurological equivalent of returning to the gym after a period of inactivity, a re-establishment of the fundamental practices at their foundational level, which clears the accumulated drift of the year and resensitizes the observing mind to patterns that may have quietly regained ground while you weren't watching. The annual reset is also an opportunity to review the year's 3-month check-ins and ask a larger question: which patterns from the original audit have been genuinely rewired, so integrated that they no longer require active attention? And which have remained consistent work throughout the year, resisting integration despite sustained effort? The answer to that second question identifies the territory that professional support, a therapist, a coach with specific expertise in the relevant pattern, would address most effectively. What to expect? Neuroplasticity is lifelong. The brain never stops changing. It is changing right now, being shaped by what you're reading, by the state of attention you're bringing to it, by the associations being formed between these concepts and your own experience. It will change tomorrow and next year and in the decade ahead, in response to what you repeatedly think and do and experience. The goal of this book, of these protocols, this framework, this entire project, is not to arrive at a fixed new self. It is not to become someone permanently immune to stress, to pattern, to regression. That self doesn't exist. The goal is to become someone who actively and consciously shapes their own neural architecture, who understands the mechanism of change and uses it deliberately, rather than being shaped entirely by repetitions they never chose. That is not a small goal. Most people live their entire lives being shaped primarily by patterns they received rather than patterns they built. The difference is not visible from the outside in any dramatic way. It shows up in the quality of ordinary moments, in the conversation that doesn't escalate, in the thought that passes rather than captures, in the decision made from deliberate choice rather than automatic response, in the relationship that deepens rather than cycling through the same wounds. The brain you are building is not a perfect brain. It is a more deliberate brain. A more observant brain. A brain with a slightly longer pause between trigger and response, and in that slightly longer pause, a life meaningfully different from the one that ran on autopilot. That is what the rewiring is for. And it is available to you, continuously, for as long as you are alive. Conclusion: the brain you built. Picture an ordinary Tuesday morning. Someone is sitting at their kitchen table, coffee cooling beside them, staring at nothing in particular. Something happened yesterday, a difficult conversation at work, the kind that used to unravel them for days. A comment delivered with an edge, a response that landed badly, a moment of public awkwardness that the old version of them would have replayed on loop until it calcified into another piece of evidence for the case against themselves. The thought is there. They can feel it, the familiar pull toward the loop, the invitation to revisit, to analyze, to assign blame and construct catastrophic projections about what it means for the future. The thought comes forward with its usual authority, as if it has a right to their full attention. And then something unremarkable happens. They notice it. They let it be there for a moment without following it. They pick up their coffee. The thought diminishes. Not dramatically, not in a rush of insight or relief, but simply and almost boringly, the way clouds pass when you stop trying to predict the weather. They finish their coffee. They go about their day. What actually changed this is what neuroplasticity looks like from the inside when it works, profoundly ordinary. There are no epiphanies in the story above. No single breakthrough moment, no dramatic realization that reorganized everything overnight. What there is instead is the accumulated effect of thousands of small repetitions, of pausing instead of reacting, of redirecting instead of looping, of choosing a different response in situations that used to admit only one. Those repetitions, individually invisible in their impact, collectively reshape the dominant pathways of a brain. Not the genome, not the deep structural architecture of personality, not the fundamental character of who this person is. Just the habitual routes that their thinking and feeling and behaving had been taking, automatically, for years. This distinction matters enormously. A rewired brain is not a new person. The ruminator who rewires does not become someone who never ruminates. The thought loops still form, still arrive with their familiar authority, still reach for the familiar territory of worry and replay. The reactor does not become placid. The amygdala still fires, the emotion still surges. The avoider does not become fearless. The pull towards safety still exists, still has gravitational force. The self-saboteur does not lose the capacity for self-doubt or the recognition of success's risks. What changes is the automaticity, the degree to which the pattern runs without consent, without awareness, without the possibility of a different outcome. And in that change in automaticity, something genuinely profound, the experience of having a life that is being chosen rather than merely inherited. The goal was never to become someone else. The goal was to become more fully yourself, to have access to the full range of what you're capable of choosing, rather than only what your most deeply worn grooves permitted. Patterns constrain the self by narrowing the possible responses to any given situation down to one, the automatic one. Rewiring doesn't constrain the self. It expands it. It adds back the full range of available responses, one practice at a time, until the automatic response is no longer the only one. The profound ordinariness of a changed brain. One of the things that surprises people who have done significant rewiring work is how little it announces itself. They had imagined, perhaps, that genuine change would feel larger. That they would wake up different, that the morning would carry a different quality of light, or that they would move through the world in a noticeably altered way, recognizable even to strangers. Some version of before and after, clearly delineated, emotionally unmistakable. The reality is more subtle and, in its way, more profound. The change shows up in specific moments, often small ones, the exchange. That doesn't escalate, the thought that passes without purchase, the decision made from ground rather than from fear. It shows up in absences, in the energy not spent on loops that used to run for hours, in the cortisol not released by a reactive chain that now short-circuits before it builds, in the conversation that doesn't exist because you redirected before the reactive comment left your mouth. It shows up in the quality of attention available for things that matter, because less of the bandwidth is consumed by things that don't. A rewired brain doesn't announce itself. It just produces slightly different consequences, consistently, over time. And those consequences, in the texture of daily relationships, in the quality of work produced in the absence of chronic cognitive drain, in the simple fact of being able to sit with a difficult thought and choose whether to follow it, accumulate into something that is genuinely a different life, even if no single moment of it felt like a transformation. The people around you may notice the change before you fully believe in it. Partners, colleagues, friends may comment on your presence, your responsiveness, your capacity to hear difficult things without immediate defensiveness. Or they may not comment at all, experiencing only the accumulated difference of thousands of small interactions that didn't go the old way. Both are fine. The work was never for an audience. Being lived by patterns versus living with them, there is a useful distinction that sits near the center of this entire project. The difference between being lived by your patterns and living with them as conscious tools. Every human brain has patterns. The question is not whether you have them, you do, and you always will. The default mode network will always run its simulations. The amygdala will always detect threat. The basal ganglia will always seek to automate the repeated. The brain is, fundamentally, a pattern-generating and pattern-executing machine. This is not a flaw to be overcome. It is the mechanism that makes complex human functioning possible, that allows you to drive a car while thinking about other things, to navigate familiar social situations without deliberating each word, to access learned skills without reconstructing them from scratch every time. The question is the degree to which your patterns operate unconsciously, automatically, on autopilot, determining your responses before your deliberate self has had any input, versus the degree to which they are known to you, visible to you, and therefore available to you as something you can work with rather than something working you. Being lived by your patterns is the default condition. It's the condition most people are in most of the time, not through failure of intelligence or character, but simply because patterns run below the threshold of conscious attention until something, pain, loss, a relationship rupture, a period of genuine reflection, a book read at the right moment, brings them into view. In that condition, your history is your destiny. The patterns formed by your early experiences, your chronic stressors, your years of repetition continue to determine your present responses without reference to what you've learned since, who you've become, or who you genuinely want to be. Living with your patterns as conscious tools is what this book has been working toward. It doesn't mean you're free of the patterns. Freedom from pattern is neurological impossibility. It means you're in a different relationship to them. You know them. You can see them activating. You have, sometimes, enough of a pause to choose whether and how to follow them. You understand that they change through repetition, and so you take your repetitions more seriously, more deliberately. When you notice the loop starting, you have a decision available that wasn't there before. When the reactive surge begins, there is a fraction of a second of consciousness in the gap where previously there was none. When the avoidance pull appears, it appears as a pull rather than as a gravity that simply carries you. You are, in the most meaningful sense, the author of your own neural architecture rather than simply its product. The work is never finished. There will be days, after everything, after the protocols, after the weeks of practice, after the genuine structural changes in your neural pathways, when the old pattern is so loud and so convincing that it feels like nothing changed at all. Days when the loop runs for hours, when the reactive response fires before you had a chance, when the avoidance wins, when the self-sabotage executes in a situation where you genuinely believed you'd broken that pattern. These days will come. They are not evidence of failure. They are evidence that you're human, with a brain that responds to stress and disruption and sleep deprivation and grief and overwhelm in the same ways all human brains do. The old pathway firing is not evidence that the new pathway isn't there. It's evidence that the old pathway is still there, which was always true, which will always be true. Two pathways existing simultaneously is the normal state of a brain that has done rewiring work. The question is not which pathway fired today. The question is which pathway is stronger this year than it was last year, and whether the gap between them is widening or closing. The answer, if you've done the work, is that the gap is widening. Slowly. Imperfectly. With setbacks that feel like they erase more than they do. But widening. Neuroplasticity is lifelong. The brain you have at 50 is genuinely different from the brain you had at 40, shaped by a decade of experiences, repetitions, practices, and choices. The brain you have at 60 will be different again. This is not a consolation. It is the actual mechanism. The work of shaping your brain does not conclude. It continues, in every repetition, in every choice to pause or to loop, to respond or to react, to engage or to avoid. What you know now that you didn't know when you started, you are doing that shaping whether you intend to or not. The brain is always being shaped by what you repeatedly do with it. The only question is whether you're doing the shaping deliberately. A note on what this effort is, for it's worth pausing, at the end, to consider the real purpose of this work. Not self-improvement as an abstract value. Not the optimization of yourself as a kind of project. Something more specific and more human. The patterns you've been working to rewire have been costing the people around you as well as costing you. The loved ones who've navigated around your reactivity. The friendships that stayed at a comfortable shallowness because the avoider in you wouldn't go further. The children, if you have them, who felt the downstream effects of unexamined defaults. The colleagues who've managed around the loops and the edges. The relationships that could have been what they almost were, if the patterns had released their grip slightly earlier. A rewired brain is not only a personal project. It is a relational one. What you build inside yourself is what you bring to every exchange, every conversation, every moment of contact with another person. The quieter loops, the wider pause, the response chosen rather than automatic, these change not just your inner life but the quality of what everyone around you receives from you. They change what your children see as the texture of daily life. They change what your partner experiences as the ground of the relationship. They change what you offer the world, which is the only contribution you can actually control. This is why the work is worth doing even when it's slow and even when it feels like nothing is changing and even when the old pattern wins again and you're exhausted from trying. Because what you're building is not just a more comfortable inner experience. It's a better version of the exchange between you and every person whose life yours touches. There is someone sitting at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. Their coffee is cooling. A thought that used to catch them like a hook in a current passes by instead, noticed, not followed, released. They don't celebrate this. It doesn't feel like a victory. It feels, increasingly, like the ordinary weather of a mind that has learned to choose its own direction. Outside the window, the day is beginning. They have choices to make, people to meet, work to do, and a brain that is different, modestly, measurably, genuinely, from the brain that used to move through those same hours on autopilot. That is the brain they built. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything that was always possible.